Welcome to the extremely boring stories. Today we listening, quiet mystery of the empty medieval village. You arrive in the region of northern England where the terrain is a quiet quilt of rolling hills, hedgerows, and uneven fields. It is the late 14th century, a time when life, for most, was a rhythm of routine and ritual, marked by the rise and fall of seasons. In this vast expanse of greenery, you come upon the remnants of a village called Netherby. Today, you might call it forgotten. In its time, it was known by its meager clusters of stone cottages, a small chapel, and a handful of thatched roof barns that sheltered both people and livestock. Netherby was not remarkable in its size or wealth. Its population likely never exceeded 100 souls, perhaps fewer, spread across half a dozen households. Yet, in its quiet way, it mirrors the slow, almost imperceptible shifts that define rural medieval life. The daily rhythm of Netherby was governed by the cycles of planting and harvesting. The villagers rose with the first light, moving through a landscape painted with the muted gold of early dawn or the soft silver of moonlight on winter snow. Work was not hurried, there was little urgency in the small fields and gardens, and the pace of life was dictated more by weather than by any lordly schedule. In such a village, the architecture tells you as much about the people as any record. The cottages were timber-framed, wattle and daub walls held together by the careful weaving of sticks and mud. Roofs were thatched, and over time, the reeds used to cover them grew thin, necessitating regular patching. Floors were of packed earth, occasionally lined with rushes to keep some semblance of warmth and cleanliness. Smoke from the central hearth curled upward through a hole in the roof, not yet channeled into chimneys, and its faint scent of burning wood and dried herbs was ever present. You can imagine families huddled around this hearth in the evenings, the flickering light illuminating faces lined with quiet endurance. The fields themselves were modest, divided by low stone walls or hedgerows that had been planted generations before. Barley, rye, and oats were grown not in abundance but enough to sustain the village. Livestock, cows, pigs, sheep, and chickens, roamed the paddocks, providing milk, meat, and eggs, while the few horses of the village were used for plowing and transportation. The villagers' lives were measured by the seasons, sowing in spring, tending in summer, harvesting in autumn, and surviving in the sparse winter months. The rhythm of labor was unremarkable, even monotonous, yet it ensured survival. Even the church, often the heart of medieval village life, spoke more of quiet consistency than grandeur. Wetherby's chapel was a single-room building, its walls rough-hewn and its wooden roof beams slightly warped by age. A simple bell called the villagers to prayer, marking Sundays and feast days, though attendance was more dutiful than devout. The priest, likely a man of modest learning, would live nearby, performing baptisms. You arrive in the region of northern England where the terrain is a quiet quilt of rolling hills, hedgerows, and uneven fields. It is the late 14th century, a time when life, for most, was a rhythm of routine and ritual, marked by the rise and fall of seasons. In this vast expanse of greenery, you come upon the remnants of a village called Netherby. Today, you might call it forgotten. In its time, it was known by its meager clusters of stone cottages, a small chapel, and a handful of thatched roof barns that sheltered both people and livestock. Netherby was not remarkable in its size or wealth. Its population likely never exceeded 100 souls, perhaps fewer, spread across half a dozen households. Yet, in its quiet way, it mirrors the slow, almost imperceptible shifts that defined rural medieval life. The daily rhythm of Netherby was governed by the cycles of planting and harvesting. The villagers rose with the first light, moving through a landscape painted with the muted gold of early dawn or the soft silver of moonlight on winter snow. Work was not hurried, there was little urgency in the small fields and gardens, and the pace of life was dictated more by weather than by any lordly schedule. In such a village, the architecture tells you as much about the people as any record. The cottages were timber-framed, wattle and daub walls held together by the careful weaving of sticks and mud. Roofs were thatched, and over time, the reeds used to cover them grew thin, necessitating regular patching. Floors were of packed earth, occasionally lined with rushes to keep some semblance of warmth and cleanliness. Smoke from the central hearth curled upward through a hole in the roof, not yet channeled into chimneys, and its faint scent of burning wood and dried herbs was ever present. You can imagine families huddled around this hearth in the evenings, the flickering light illuminating faces lined with quiet endurance. The fields themselves were modest, divided by low stone walls or hedgerows that had been planted generations before. Barley, rye, and oats were grown not in abundance but enough to sustain the village. Livestock, cows, pigs, sheep, and chickens, roamed the paddocks, providing milk, meat, and eggs, while the few horses of the village were used for plowing and transportation. The villagers' lives were measured by the seasons, sowing in spring, tending in summer, harvesting in autumn, and surviving in the sparse winter months. The rhythm of labor was unremarkable, even monotonous, yet it ensured survival. Even the church, often the heart of medieval village life, spoke more of quiet consistency than grandeur. Weatherby's chapel was a single-room building, its walls rough-hewn and its wooden roof beams slightly warped by age. A simple bell called the villagers to prayer, marking Sundays and feast days, though attendance was more dutiful than devout. The priest, likely a man of modest learning, would live nearby, performing baptisms. The quiet departure of Netherby's inhabitants was not sudden, but it left behind subtle traces that speak volumes to the patient observer. As the decades passed, the fields that once bore barley and rye grew wild with grasses and weeds, slowly reclaiming the patterns of cultivation. Paths between cottages became faint, often overgrown by hedgerows that expanded unchallenged. Stone foundations, once the walls of kitchens and bedrooms, sank into the earth or crumbled under the weight of time and weather. What remains was not dramatic, but its slow erosion tells a story of human life receding, almost imperceptibly, from the land. To understand the decline of Netherby, it helps to look at the economic and social pressures of the time. Northern England in the late 14th and early 15th centuries was a place of gradual instability. The aftermath of the Black Death had reshaped populations, labor markets, and land ownership. Families in small villages like Netherby often found themselves unable to maintain the delicate balance of resources. Labor shortages meant that fields went untilled, barns went unfilled, and tasks that had once been routine now became overwhelming burdens. Villagers faced hard choices: remain and risk scarcity, or leave in search of more promising prospects. In Netherby, subtle signs of this struggle can be inferred from historical records. Tax rolls suggest that the village contributed less and less to the local lord as the years progressed. Individual names appear fewer times, and eventually, Certain households vanished from records entirely. While no chronicler wrote a dramatic account of the village's end, the repetition of absences across decades paints a picture of gradual desertion. Families did not vanish overnight. Children grew into adults who moved to towns or more fertile villages, leaving parents behind until even they departed or passed away. The decline was measured in years and generations rather than days and months. Life within the village before its abandonment was governed by a quiet, almost hypnotic routine. Each morning, farmers tended their plots, measuring out seed carefully, tending to livestock, repairing fences and tools. Work extended from dawn until dusk, punctuated by meals prepared over modest hearths. Porridge, gruel, and occasionally roasted meat formed the staple diet. Milk, cheese, and vegetables supplemented these, grown in small gardens near each cottage. The simplicity of these meals reflected both the limitations and the resourcefulness of medieval rural life. There was little room for indulgence. Survival demanded attention to small but continuous tasks. The domestic sphere was equally structured. Women spent hours spinning wool, weaving cloth, and mending garments. They fetched water from wells or nearby streams, often carrying it in heavy wooden buckets. Children helped with chores, learning the rhythms of the village almost as soon as they could walk. The elderly, if they survived, provided guidance and preserved knowledge of planting cycles, herbal remedies, and the management of livestock. Life was repetitive, quiet, and methodical, a series of small, deliberate actions that kept the village functioning. Yet beneath the surface of routine, there were the subtle tensions of survival. Weather dictated much. A late frost could destroy seedlings, an early frost could ruin ripening grain. Floods or dry spells tested the villagers' patience and planning. Disease was another constant presence. Smallpox, dysentery, and other ailments were ever-present threats, though they rarely merited chronicling unless particularly severe. Villagers relied on remedies passed down through generations, herbs, poultices, simple hygiene, and their understanding of illness was practical rather than scientific. The village's chapel, which had once served as both a spiritual and social hub, gradually fell into disuse. Priests were often reassigned or passed away, and the building itself required maintenance the dwindling population could scarcely manage. Without a functioning chapel, communal gatherings became less frequent, weakening the cohesion that had bound families together. This slow disintegration of social structures mirrored the erosion of physical structures. As stones cracked and wood rotted, so too did the sense of shared purpose that had held the village alive. Trade and contact with neighboring villages also dwindled. Fewer people meant fewer goods to sell, and travel for essentials became less practical. Small markets in nearby towns continued, but Netherby's contribution dwindled as families left, diminishing the village's economic relevance. Isolation grew, not dramatically, but incrementally, a creeping quiet that emphasized absence over presence. The village became a place where silence grew louder with each passing year. One intriguing element of Netherby's decline is the role of inheritance and land management. Land in medieval England was divided according to local customs and family arrangements. As younger generations moved away, plots were consolidated or sold. Those who remained often struggled to maintain sufficient income from a reduced landholding. The pressure to consolidate or sell land created ripple effects, slowly hollowing out the village. families who might have endured through mutual support instead made the practical choice to depart, leaving behind empty cottages and abandoned fields. The physical landscape itself began to mirror the fading human presence. Overgrown hedgerows swallowed pathways. Roofs collapsed under winter snows. Chimneys, once channels for smoke and warmth, stood empty against the sky. Wells that had drawn clear water slowly became clogged with debris. Barns, stripped for timber or left to decay, no longer sheltered livestock. In the quiet of late autumn or winter, a visitor might hear only the wind through trees or the distant call of birds, the same sounds that would have existed before the village was founded. Nature reclaimed what had been carefully managed, erasing the fingerprints of human labor almost entirely. The small artifacts left behind speak quietly of daily life. Pieces of pottery, now cracked and faded, hint at the meals once prepared. Tools, iron sickles, wooden rakes, simple plows, remain scattered or buried, their function now silent. A fragment of a spinning wheel or loom suggests a domestic industry that kept families clothed and sustained. Even the simplest objects, when examined closely, reveal the patient endurance of villagers who sought only to live within the constraints of their world. Yet even amid these traces, questions linger. Did the villagers of Netherby feel a sense of loss as they departed, or did they experience relief at leaving a place that had become increasingly fragile? Were there moments of hesitation, the kind that might linger in memory and story but leave no written record? Perhaps some families clung stubbornly to hearth and home, only to be finally persuaded by necessity. Or perhaps they simply slipped away quietly, one household at a time, leaving the village to the mercy of wind and rain. As you walk through the remnants of Netherby, it becomes evident that the village's story is not one of dramatic events or heroic deeds. It is the story of subtle change, of incremental decline, of ordinary lives responding to ordinary pressures. And yet, within this quiet narrative, there is a compelling mystery. The precise reasons for Netherby's eventual emptiness remain obscured. We can infer patterns, observe the consequences, and reconstruct daily life in careful detail, but the lived experiences of the last villagers, their emotions, their choices, their fears, remain largely unknown. The village seems to ask you to consider the delicate balance of survival. How many small inconveniences, how many repeated hardships, how many quiet calculations are required before a community dissolves? When a village disappears without fire, plague, or war, what does that tell us about the resilience and fragility of human settlements? Netherby's story is composed not of dramatic moments, but of the slow accumulation of subtle pressures that, over decades, led to silence. It is a lesson in patience, observation, and reflection. Sometimes, history is most profound not in what shouts for attention, but in what quietly fades away. You arrive in the gentle countryside of southern England, where the hills slope slowly toward the River Alder, a narrow, winding stream that has shaped the landscape for centuries. Nestled along its banks was a small village called Alderford, a modest settlement whose defining feature was not its cottages, gardens, or people, but its mills. These mills, a cluster of water-driven wheels and stone structures, were the heartbeat of the village for generations. They ground grain, powered small industries, and structured the rhythm of daily life. Today, their remains are few. mostly moss-covered foundations, but in the 14th and 15th centuries, they were a central and unassuming hub of survival and labor. The first thing to understand about Alderford's mills is how quietly indispensable they were. Unlike castles or cathedrals, which might dominate a landscape visually and socially, the mills functioned silently, almost invisibly, yet their absence would have been felt immediately. Each morning, as light crept over the hills, the water wheels would begin their slow, deliberate rotation, turning the mechanisms inside. The rhythm of creaking wood and splashing water was subtle, not particularly loud, but persistent enough to set a gentle cadence for the village. Water power was not new, but in Alderford, it shaped almost every aspect of life. Grain from nearby fields, wheat, rye, barley, and oats, was brought to the mills for grinding. Farmers carried sacks of harvested grain on carts or on their backs, negotiating narrow, uneven roads, sometimes muddy and treacherous after rainfall. Milling was an intimate, hands-on process. The miller, often a man of modest means but considerable skill, adjusted the stones, monitored the flow of water, and ensured that the grain was ground to the right consistency. There was no rush, the process demanded patience. Too fast, and the flour could scorch; too slow, and it might retain husks, making it less suitable for bread. The milling itself was quiet work, though not without its small hazards. Water wheels required constant maintenance, wood needed replacing, iron fittings oiled, stones dressed to prevent uneven grinding. The sound of grinding was a dull, low hum, a constant companion to villagers working nearby. Children might watch the process with fascination, occasionally learning the intricacies of balancing grain flow with wheel speed, or the correct method for bagging flour. The miller was both technician and guardian, responsible not only for the grain but also for the smooth operation of the machinery that sustained the village. Milling was also deeply tied to the rhythms of commerce and feudal obligation. Many villagers did not own the mills but owed a portion of their grain or flour to the miller or the local lord. This practice, known as milling rights or soak, meant that the miller's influence was quietly significant. Villagers might grumble about the small fraction taken, but the mills were so essential that they had no choice but to comply. The arrangement kept life moving, the fields productive, and the bread baskets filled. Yet Alderford's mills were fragile, despite their importance. They depended entirely on the river's consistency. In years of drought, the flow slowed, the wheels turned sluggishly, and grain grinding became a challenge. In floods, water could wash away sections of the mill, damage mechanisms, or even erode foundations. The villagers were always conscious of these threats, though most of the time, they were minor inconveniences rather than disasters. The subtle tension between human effort and environmental variability defined life in Alderford more than any dramatic event. The mills also shaped social life in quiet ways. Farmers often lingered after their grain had been processed, exchanging news or advice, observing the subtle changes in the river, and noting the condition of their neighbors' fields. The rhythm of the mills marked the passage of time as much as the turning of seasons. Festivals and communal gatherings were occasionally scheduled around harvests and milling, though these were small and practical rather than grand spectacles. Life here was unhurried, cyclical, and predictable, an ordinary existence with an extraordinary dependence on simple technology. Over time, however, Signs of decline began to appear. Some mills fell into disrepair as the families that maintained them moved away or could no longer afford the labor required. Water wheels rotted, wooden gears warped, and stones cracked. Grain that had once been processed smoothly now accumulated unevenly, sometimes forcing villagers to travel further afield. The miller, if he remained, often became an itinerant figure, wandering from one failing wheel to another in a quiet struggle to keep operations functional. These small failures, almost imperceptible year to year, slowly undermined the village's sustainability. There is evidence that Alderford's decline was gradual, like the creeping quiet in Netherby. Tax records, land transfers, and parish registers show the population decreasing steadily. Children were born in smaller numbers, and young adults increasingly left for towns, drawn by opportunities the village could no longer provide. The mills, once the central feature, became increasingly irrelevant, not destroyed violently, but ignored. One wheel might still turn, but its neighbor was broken and idle. A slow, almost imperceptible decay had begun to dominate life along the river. Despite their eventual disappearance, the mills of Alderford left traces of human ingenuity and quiet labor. Stone channels carved to guide water, grooves in the grinding stones, and rusted iron fittings speak of careful thought, trial and error, and the patient repetition of generations. These artifacts tell a subtle story. Life was unremarkable, but it was sustained by knowledge, skill, and daily diligence. Even when the villagers abandoned Alderford, the marks of their work remained, whispering the hum of wheels and the murmur of flowing water across centuries. There is a curious tension in reflecting on Alderford. The village's dependence on its mills highlights both resilience and fragility. The mills were the product of human skill, yet they were vulnerable to environmental pressures, social change, and shifting economic conditions. In this interplay of human and natural systems, one sees the ordinary drama of survival, nothing catastrophic, nothing sensational, yet infinitely delicate. And as you stand beside the remnants of a moss-covered wheel or the dry bed of a water channel, the question arises, what happens when the mechanisms that sustain a community fail, not suddenly, but gradually? How does a village respond when the very structure that defines daily life becomes unreliable? Alderford does not answer these questions directly, only hints at them through the quiet erosion of stone, wood, and water. The disappearing mills were not a spectacle. They were subtle, almost invisible indicators of the passage of time and the impermanence of human endeavor. Their story is not one of triumph or conquest but of quiet labor, incremental failure, and eventual disappearance. They remind us that history is not only composed of dramatic events but also of the slow, measured decline of ordinary institutions, of ordinary lives, and of communities whose significance is felt most keenly in their absence. By the late 14th century, Alderford was a village of quiet productivity. Its mills were no longer just machines, they were woven into the rhythm of daily life. Villagers structured their days around the predictable movement of water over wooden wheels, the slow, steady grind of stones, and the careful sifting of flour. These were not dramatic processes, but they were essential. Without them, the village could not feed itself. Without them, the small economy of Alderford, its trade with neighboring towns, the obligations to the Lord, the domestic routines, would falter. Milling required a degree of technical knowledge that few outside the profession appreciated. The miller had to understand the nuances of water flow, adjusting sluice gates and channels to ensure the wheel turned at a steady pace. He had to maintain the grinding stones, dressing them to keep a consistent surface and prevent grain from clogging. Wooden gears, often lubricated with animal fat, creaked under constant strain. A miller's day was long and measured, punctuated by small mechanical checks rather than conversations or celebrations. The work was repetitive, almost hypnotic, yet vital. The villagers interacted with the mills regularly, not only for their own sustenance but as part of the social fabric of Alderford. Bringing grain to be milled was rarely a solitary task. Neighbors might travel together, exchanging news or advice, discussing crop yields, or observing the river's behavior. These moments of social contact, brief and subdued, sustained relationships in a community that otherwise lived largely isolated within its own fields and cottages. The mills were a nexus of social, economic, and practical life, their importance understated but undeniable. Over time, however, the mills themselves began to reveal the vulnerabilities of this quiet village. Water flow in the Alder was not constant. During dry summers, the river's level fell, slowing the wheels and forcing villagers to wait longer for their grain. In wet winters, floods could breach the banks, eroding foundations and washing away wooden components. These disruptions were never catastrophic, but they created frustration and subtle shifts in behavior. Farmers might delay planting or harvesting to accommodate the mill's unreliability, or they might experiment with alternative grinding methods, such as hand quirts, though these were labor-intensive and inefficient. Economic pressures compounded the problem. Alderford's population was small and declining. Younger generations were increasingly drawn to towns, where wages could be earned and opportunities found beyond the constraints of the village. As families departed, the burden of maintaining the mills fell on fewer shoulders. The miller, once a figure of routine authority, often became overextended, unable to attend to all the maintenance the wheels required. Slowly, small failures accumulated, gears warped, sluices leaked, stones cracked. The mills became less reliable, and the villagers' confidence in them eroded. Interestingly, the village's records hinted social adaptations to these pressures. Some families consolidated land and shared milling responsibilities, attempting to maintain operations despite diminished numbers. Others traveled farther afield to neighboring mills, paying for services they had once accessed locally. The rhythm of the village subtly shifted from reliance on its own infrastructure to dependence on external resources, a quiet acknowledgement of decline that left no dramatic evidence but had profound consequences. Daily life at the mills was also marked by subtle hazards. Children, often curious, sometimes lingered too close to the water wheels or stone gears. Farmers moving sacks of grain occasionally slipped on wet wooden planks or uneven paths. Millers themselves faced fatigue, the long hours compounded by the mental focus required to monitor water flow and maintain machinery. Accidents were rare but inevitable, contributing to the incremental stress on a small community already balancing numerous pressures. The mills also had symbolic significance, though understated. They were a tangible expression of human ingenuity, of the capacity to harness natural forces to sustain life. The rotation of the wheel, the grinding of grain, the movement of water, all of it reflected centuries of accumulated knowledge. Yet this symbol of human skill was fragile, dependent on environmental stability, labor availability, and careful maintenance. In this fragility lies the subtle drama of Alderford's story. Life and survival were not guaranteed, even in ordinary routines. By the mid-15th century, Alderford's decline was evident not just in the mills but in the village as a whole. Population loss was steady. Fields that once produced modest surpluses lay fallow or were overrun by weeds. Barns and cottages began to show signs of neglect, roofs leaked, timber rotted, and thatched coverings thinned. The mills, which had once marked the heartbeat of the community, now seemed to creak in protest against the quiet that was slowly swallowing the village. The disappearance of the mills was not sudden. One wheel might stop turning in a dry summer, another might fail after winter floods. The stone channels directing water to the wheels became clogged, sluices eroded, and the mechanisms corroded. By the time the villagers fully understood that the mills could no longer be relied upon, many had already left, seeking security, livelihood, or simply the rhythm of a functioning community elsewhere. The decline was incremental, almost imperceptible, a slow erosion that mirrored the steady flow of the Alder River itself. In reflecting on Alderford, you notice a pattern common to small medieval villages. Decline often comes quietly, through ordinary pressures rather than dramatic events. The mills did not vanish because of war or plague. They disappeared because of a combination of environmental challenges, economic pressures, demographic shifts, and the subtle accumulation of neglect. Life in Alderford, like life in many small settlements, was a balance of labor, skill, and patience, a balance easily disturbed by the smallest disturbances. And yet, even as the mills fell into ruin, their traces persisted. Channels, moss-covered stones, and remnants of wooden gears remained as silent testimony to centuries of human effort. These artifacts offer a window into the practical knowledge and quiet endurance of the villagers, whose lives were measured not in dramatic events but in the patient management of routine and the subtle negotiation with nature. As you stand beside the remnants of a water wheel, imagining the steady hum of grinding stones and the gentle splash of flowing water, a question arises: what other villages, dependent on such fragile technologies, quietly faded from the map without leaving dramatic stories? How many communities have disappeared in the slow accumulation of everyday pressures, leaving behind only the faintest traces of their labor and ingenuity? Alderford reminds you that history is often less about moments of spectacle than about the quiet persistence and impermanence of ordinary life. By the late 15th century, Alderford's mills had largely ceased to function. One wheel might still turn, creaking unevenly under the weight of insufficient water, but most of the mechanisms had succumbed to time and neglect. The villagers who remained were few, scattered across the surrounding hills, tending small plots and keeping only minimal livestock. Some families had abandoned the village entirely, seeking livelihoods in larger towns or more fertile villages. The mills, once the quiet heartbeat of Alderford, now stood as silent witnesses to decades of gradual decline. The physical decay of the mills was mirrored by the social dissolution of the village. Without reliable milling, the small-scale economy faltered. Farmers who might once have produced a surplus to trade could no longer process their grain efficiently. Obligations to the Lord went unmet, though the consequences were subtle. Warnings, fines, and eventual reassignment of land rather than immediate punishment. Families struggled to survive in increasingly self-reliant ways, substituting hand grinding for water-powered milling. But this labor-intensive method was slow and exhausting, further discouraging remaining residents from staying long-term. Interestingly, some villagers attempted to maintain the mills despite declining numbers. Local records suggest that temporary repairs were undertaken, wooden gears replaced, sluices cleared, and stone channels dredged to redirect the flow of the Older. These efforts, while commendable, could not reverse the gradual erosion of resources and population. Labor shortages, unpredictable weather, and demographic shifts meant that even the best-intentioned repairs were often temporary. Slowly, the village adapted to its own decline, shifting from dependence on communal structures to isolated self-sufficiency. The mills themselves, now partially collapsed or abandoned, became part of the landscape. Moss and ivy crept over stone foundations. Wooden beams sagged and cracked. The gentle hum of grinding stones and splashing water, the sound that had structured life in Alderford, was gone. Nature reclaimed its space quietly. Reeds grew along the riverbanks, birds nested in the remaining beams, and small mammals burrowed in what remained of the machinery. In the absence of human oversight, the mills became a subtle monument to labor, endurance, and impermanence. Despite the decline, the story of Alderford is not one of failure alone. The mills represent centuries of ingenuity and quiet human skill. Their construction required precise knowledge of water flow, mechanics, and material durability. The villagers relied on them for sustenance, community cohesion, and the rhythm of daily life. The slow disappearance of the mills reflects not a single catastrophe but the accumulation of ordinary pressures, environmental variability, population shifts, and economic limitations. This pattern, incremental decline rather than sudden disaster, offers a unique perspective on the fragility of human settlements in the medieval period. By the early 16th century, Alderford had become, in many ways, a ghost of its former self. The remaining villagers either abandoned the mills or relied on hand grinding entirely. Families moved away in search of greater security or opportunity. Fields once actively tilled lay fallow or became overgrown, and barns and cottages began to crumble without maintenance. The quiet disappearance of the mills mirrored the disappearance of the village, gradual, almost imperceptible, but inevitable. What lingers most, however, is the sense of human persistence. The mills may have failed, but for centuries they had allowed a community to survive, thrive, and interact with the natural environment in a balanced, if unremarkable, way. Their disappearance is a reminder that ordinary ingenuity can sustain life quietly for long periods, even if it cannot guarantee permanence. The story of Alderford is both ordinary and extraordinary, a testament to the quiet rhythms that define survival, and the subtle pressures that eventually end it. And as you walk along the overgrown riverbanks, examining the moss-covered stones and collapsed wheels, one question persists: how many other villages relied on such fragile centers of labor, and how many quietly disappeared when their essential mechanisms faltered, leaving behind only the faintest traces for those who would visit centuries later? Alderford teaches you that history is often composed not of dramatic upheavals, but of patient, incremental change, and the silent consequences of ordinary life. You find yourself walking through the low, mist-laden hills of the Vale of Evermere, a secluded stretch of countryside in medieval England where the earth folds gently into valleys and small streams wind lazily through meadows. This valley, more remote than neighboring regions, once held a modest community clustered around a handful of cottages, a small chapel, and the quiet hum of daily labor. The village of Evermere is now famous not for battles or royal decrees, but for the eerie quiet it left behind, a silence so complete that centuries later, historians and wanderers alike still speculate on the fate of its inhabitants. Evermere was neither large nor prosperous. Its population likely numbered only 50 or 60 people, spread across half a dozen households. The land was fertile enough for subsistence farming, producing wheat, barley, and oats, but it was also prone to seasonal flooding. Streams that provided water for both irrigation and domestic use could swell unpredictably, submerging pastures and low-lying fields. Villagers adapted by raising simple embankments or planting crops on higher ground, but these precautions were never perfect. Life here was a balance of effort, attention, and quiet patience, with survival depending on the meticulous observation of the natural environment. Cottages in Evermere were modest, built from timber and wattle and daub, with roofs of thatch. Floors were simple earth-packed hard, sometimes lined with rushes for insulation. Smoke from the hearths curled upward through small holes in the roof, filling the interior with a faint, persistent aroma of burning wood. Each cottage functioned as both living space and workspace. Women spun wool or wove cloth, men repaired tools or tended to small flocks, and children performed chores from an early age. The rhythm of life was deliberate and repetitive, a slow cadence dictated by daylight, seasons, and the needs of survival. The chapel, a small single-room structure, served as both spiritual center and community gathering place. A single bell called villagers to prayer, marking Sundays, holy days, and occasional festivals. The priest, likely a man of limited education, performed baptisms, marriages, and funerals with a calm, procedural approach. Services were quiet, often attended by only a fraction of the village at a time. Religion provided structure and a sense of order, but it was never a source of spectacle or drama. Its presence was subtle, almost like a background hum that shaped the daily lives of villagers more than it dominated them. Evermere's social fabric was simple yet complex. Families were interdependent, tied together through labor, trade, and kinship. Tasks were divided according to age, ability, and gender. Men plowed and harvested, women prepared meals, tended gardens, and cared for children. Elders offered guidance and shared practical knowledge. Children learned by doing, absorbing the quiet lessons of their parents and grandparents. The village was organized not through written rules or law, but through practical necessity and the repetition of daily routines. Trade and contact with the outside world were limited but consistent. Villagers occasionally traveled to nearby market towns to sell grain, eggs, or wool, or to purchase tools, salt, and iron goods. Journeys were infrequent, planned around both necessity and the condition of roads, which were often muddy, uneven, or prone to flooding. Letters were rare. News traveled by word of mouth or through itinerant merchants and travelers. Life in Evermere was largely self-contained, with the valley's geography fostering a sense of quiet isolation. Yet, despite this seeming stability, Evermere held subtle mysteries. Historical records indicate that the village's population began to decline in the late 14th century, for reasons that remain unclear. There are no accounts of plague, invasion, or famine severe enough to destroy the community. Instead, the village appears to have emptied gradually, over decades. Families departed, often without fanfare, leaving behind cottages, fields, and the chapel, which slowly fell into disrepair. By the early 15th century, the valley was nearly silent, occupied only by wandering livestock and the occasional traveler who noticed the empty homes and overgrown paths. One of the most intriguing aspects of Evermere is its lack of visible catastrophe. Unlike other villages abandoned due to war or disease, there are no burned structures, mass graves, or evidence of violent conflict. The silence of Evermere is pervasive and deliberate, suggesting a series of small, cumulative pressures rather than a single dramatic event. Weather, economic pressures, population shifts, and perhaps subtle social tensions may have contributed, but the precise combination remains unknown. The physical traces of the village speak softly of the lives once lived. Stone foundations peek through the soil, barely distinguishable from the surrounding grass. Thatched roofs have long since collapsed, leaving small piles of rotted reeds, tools, pottery fragments, and remnants of wooden furniture occasionally surface, offering glimpses into the practical routines of daily life. These artifacts tell a story of endurance, of ordinary people navigating ordinary challenges, without the upheavals that typically mark history. Even as the village emptied, the landscape itself seemed to adapt to the absence. Gardens reverted to wildflowers, cultivated fields were overtaken by grasses and weeds, and the streams, once managed carefully to irrigate crops and drive simple water wheels, returned to a natural course. The rhythm of human life disappeared, leaving the quiet sounds of nature to dominate the vale. Birds nested in the eaves of abandoned cottages, foxes and badgers took residence in the barns, and the wind carried an uninterrupted murmur through the empty streets. Evermere's silence raises questions that remain unresolved even today. Did the villagers leave voluntarily, seeking better opportunities elsewhere? Were they responding to subtle ecological changes, such as soil depletion or flooding, that made survival increasingly difficult? Or was there an unrecorded social or economic factor that gradually eroded the community's cohesion? The absence of definitive records makes Evermere both fascinating and frustrating, a historical puzzle with no single solution. As you stand in the vale, observing the quiet remains of the village, the emptiness itself becomes a central character. It is a silence composed not of sudden absence, but of decades of slow, patient departure. Each empty cottage, each overgrown path, speaks of a life once lived in a community slowly dissolving. The silence is neither threatening nor dramatic, it is simply persistent, demanding attention in its very ordinariness. The quiet decline of Evermere was not marked by fire, plague, or conquest, but by the slow accumulation of small challenges that gradually eroded the village's ability to sustain itself. Each household faced pressures both visible and invisible, from the unpredictability of the weather to the shifting availability of labor, to the subtle constraints imposed by the social and economic systems of the late medieval period. In this way, Evermere serves as an example of how ordinary pressures, repeated over time, can lead to extraordinary outcomes, an entire village fading into near silence. Daily life in Evermere was a careful negotiation with nature. The Vale, while fertile, was not immune to the whims of climate. Seasonal flooding could sweep across the fields, eroding topsoil and drowning crops. Winters brought snow and ice that made travel to neighboring villages treacherous, sometimes isolating families for weeks. Even small shifts in rainfall could dramatically influence grain yields. Villagers responded to these pressures with ingenuity. Temporary dikes were built to channel excess water, seeds were planted on slightly elevated land, and livestock was moved to higher pastures. Yet, these measures were never perfect. Each year brought the quiet anxiety of uncertainty, a sense that survival required constant attention and careful judgment. The economic realities of the time compounded these environmental pressures. Evermere was not a wealthy village. Most households operated at or near subsistence level. Grain yields had to be shared with the local lord, and taxes or tithes were a regular obligation. If a season failed, families faced the difficult choice of rationing or supplementing their diet with foraged foods, nuts, wild fruits, and edible roots. Trade with nearby towns helped, but travel was not always practical or safe, and the cost of goods could be prohibitive. These small pressures, repeated over years, may have contributed to the gradual decision of families to leave, seeking steadier livelihoods elsewhere. The social structure of Evermere also influenced the village's resilience, or fragility. Cooperation was essential for survival, particularly during planting and harvest seasons. Families often pooled labor, assisting neighbors with plowing, sowing, and threshing. Yet subtle tensions could arise over land disputes, inheritance claims, or the division of scarce resources. These social pressures were rarely dramatic, but over time, they could contribute to the erosion of community cohesion. A household that moved away might inspire others to consider departure, not in response to a single event but through the quiet logic of practicality. The village's small chapel illustrates another aspect of Evermere's slow decline. Once a hub of communal activity, the chapel became less attended as families departed. With fewer parishioners, services were reduced, and the priest, if he remained, likely divided his attention among other villages. Rituals that had once punctuated the rhythm of life, baptisms, weddings, feast day services, became rarer. In the absence of these gatherings, the village lost a subtle but important source of social cohesion. Silence settled not only in the physical structures but also in the spaces of communal interaction, reinforcing the sense of gradual emptiness. Evermere's physical structures began to deteriorate in concert with its population. Thatched roofs thinned or collapsed, cottages sagged, and wooden beams rotted under the weight of rain and snow. Fields once carefully plowed became uneven, grass overtaking cultivated plots. Fences decayed, allowing livestock to wander, sometimes damaging neighboring property. Even minor neglect, repeated over decades, transformed the village from a functional settlement to a collection of fragile structures barely able to withstand the seasons. One of the more subtle elements of Evermere's decline was the disappearance of younger generations. Children learned the skills of farming and household management from their elders, but as opportunities in towns increased, many adolescents left, reducing the labor pool necessary to maintain both fields and infrastructure. This demographic shift left remaining families struggling to accomplish tasks that had previously been routine. Gradually, Even basic maintenance became difficult, accelerating the deterioration of homes, meals, gardens, and roads. Interestingly, the historical record hints at attempts to sustain the village despite these challenges. Temporary repairs to cottages, small-scale improvements to drainage systems, and minor enhancements to communal facilities suggest that residents were aware of the risks and attempted to mitigate them. Yet these efforts were constrained by limited labor, modest resources, and the persistent pull of outside opportunities. In the end, the cumulative weight of small pressures proved greater than any individual effort to maintain stability. By the early 15th century, the once quiet hum of Evermere's daily life had grown faint. Fewer villagers tilled the fields, fewer fires burned in the cottages, and the chapel rang its bell only occasionally, if at all. Those who remained were increasingly isolated, their routines stretched across larger plots and longer distances. Travel to neighboring settlements became a necessity rather than an occasional convenience, eroding the village's self-sufficiency. Nature reclaimed what humans had cultivated, and silence settled firmly over the vale. The mystery of Evermere lies not in dramatic catastrophe but in the ordinariness of its decline. There was no single event to mark the village's end. Instead, the disappearance occurred as the result of multiple subtle pressures, each one unremarkable on its own but collectively powerful. Environmental variability, economic constraints, social dynamics, and demographic shifts worked quietly, invisibly, to hollow out the village over decades. In the shadow of the dense blackwood forest, a modest fort once stood, a quiet sentinel of wood and stone, neither imposing nor heavily garrisoned, yet integral to the surrounding settlements. Unlike the great castles chronicled in the annals of medieval Europe, the fort at Blackwood did not witness grand battles or royal ceremonies. Its significance lay in routine, in the slow management of territory and the subtle maintenance of safety. Today, all that remains are scattered stones, moss-covered walls, and the faint outline of defensive ditches. But in its time, the fort shaped the rhythms of life in a small, often overlooked corner of the kingdom. The fort's primary purpose was pragmatic. It provided a modest place of refuge for villagers during times of minor unrest, a secure storage for food and supplies, and a center from which a small contingent of guards could monitor the surrounding forest and the roads that wound through it. In contrast to sprawling castles, Blackwood was intimate, almost domestic in scale. Its wooden palisades and stone foundations reflected the labor and resources of the local community rather than royal ambition. It was not designed to resist prolonged sieges, nor to host armies, but to serve as a quiet anchor in a landscape where isolation was the norm and small threats, roving bandits, errant mercenaries, or occasional disputes over grazing rights, required practical vigilance. Daily life in and around the fort was marked by routine and repetition. Guards rotated shifts quietly, checking the palisade, monitoring the river crossing, and patrolling the nearby forest edge. They were local men, often farmers who spent most of their year tending crops, only donning armor and wielding weapons when duty called. The work was monotonous yet essential. Attention to small details, a loose plank, a shifted stone, a distant rustle in the undergrowth, could mean the difference between minor annoyance and significant loss. Inside the fort, storage rooms held grain, preserved meat, and basic tools. These stores were maintained with careful attention, replenished from nearby villages at regular intervals. In times of scarcity, the fort could support a modest number of residents for a limited period, but it was never a self-sufficient settlement. Life there depended on coordination, foresight, and diligence, the very ordinary qualities that ensured survival more than courage or valor. The fort also functioned as a point of organization for the surrounding villages. Local disputes over boundaries, grazing, and minor thefts were often mediated there, with guards or appointed elders serving as intermediaries. Meetings were not dramatic trials or public spectacles, they were quiet deliberations, often conducted in low tones or in small groups. Justice, in this sense, was as much about maintaining practical relationships and routines as about enforcing abstract law. Environmental factors played a constant, understated role. The Blackwood Forest was both resource and challenge. Timber from the forest maintained the fort's palisades, while hunting provided supplementary food. Yet the forest also harbored dangers, the occasional wolf or boar, hidden marshes, and dense undergrowth that could conceal both animals and human threats. Seasonal changes dictated labor cycles. Heavy snow might isolate the fort for weeks, while spring floods could make river crossings treacherous. These natural rhythms, subtle yet persistent, governed the daily routines of the fort's residents. Historical records suggest that Blackwood was never a site of large-scale conflict, yet it was occasionally tested. Minor raids, disputes over forest rights, and the movement of transient mercenaries placed pressure on the small contingent of guards. Even these challenges were often resolved quietly, through negotiation, shared labor, or small acts of vigilance rather than dramatic combat. The fort's story, then, is one of quiet maintenance, of measured responses to persistent, ordinary pressures. Over time, the fort's presence faded from importance. As roads improved, nearby towns grew more influential, and local conflicts diminished. The need for a small defensive structure waned. Guards were reassigned or left for better opportunities, and the fort's stores were depleted. Stone and timber were repurposed by villagers for homes or fences. By the end of the 15th century, Blackwood had become increasingly empty, a skeletal outline of its former function. Yet even in abandonment, it shaped the landscape. Ditches continued to channel water, foundations influenced soil and vegetation, and the faint hum of past activity lingered in the mind of anyone who wandered among its remnants. The abandoned fort raises subtle questions about the impermanence of structures and institutions. How does a community respond when a once useful facility becomes redundant? How do ordinary people adapt when routines and protective measures disappear quietly, without dramatic loss? Blackwood offers no definitive answers, only the quiet traces of ordinary lives responding to ordinary needs. By the 14th century, the fort at Blackwood had settled into a rhythm of quiet functionality. Its presence was modest, yet it played a crucial role in the everyday lives of those living nearby. Farmers, shepherds, and woodcutters would occasionally visit the fort, bringing news of crop yields, minor disputes, or wandering animals. The guards, often local men accustomed to both labor in the fields and vigilance in the forest, performed their duties with understated diligence. Their work was repetitive, sometimes dull, yet entirely essential to maintaining the fragile security of the region. The fort's architecture reflected its practical purpose. The walls, though simple, were carefully constructed. Timber palisades reinforced with occasional stone blocks provided basic defense, while shallow ditches diverted seasonal runoff and created a modest barrier. Inside, small rooms stored grain, salted meat, tools, and spare timber. Living quarters were Spartan, offering only shelter, warmth, and a space for quiet domestic tasks. There were no grand halls, no impressive battlements, only the careful arrangements necessary to sustain life in a small, sometimes isolated community. Daily life in the fort was structured and methodical. Guards took turns monitoring the surrounding forest, inspecting ditches, repairing weak timbers, and tending small gardens within the fort's perimeter. Each task was unremarkable, yet collectively they ensured the fort could fulfill its function. During daylight hours, the creaking of wooden wheels, the dull scraping of tools against stone, and the soft rustle of the river nearby formed a subtle symphony of quiet labor. Meals were simple: bread, porridge, vegetables, occasionally supplemented with salted or smoked meat. These routines may seem mundane, but they were the backbone of survival. Interactions between villagers and the fort were equally understated. Farmers occasionally delivered surplus grain or timber, settling minor obligations and receiving practical advice from guards. Small disputes, over grazing rights, property boundaries, or lost livestock, were mediated quietly by the fort's custodians. The process was rarely dramatic. Agreements were reached through discussion, modest compromise, and careful attention to precedent. Life in the Vale, while peaceful, required these quiet systems to function smoothly. Yet the fort was not without its vulnerabilities. Its reliance on local labor and nearby resources made it sensitive to demographic shifts. If families moved away or fields were abandoned, the fort's capacity to maintain itself diminished. Environmental pressures, flooded ditches, fallen trees, or winter snows, placed additional strain on the small contingent of residents. Even minor damage, if left unaddressed, could compromise the fort's functionality. These pressures were ordinary, predictable, and cumulative, demonstrating how slow change often has a greater impact than sudden upheaval. Historical records indicate occasional small-scale threats to the fort. Roaming bandits, disputes among neighboring villages, or errant mercenaries occasionally prompted alerts. Guards responded not with grand battle tactics, but through observation, minor deterrence, and coordination with villagers. The fort's value lay in these quiet preventive measures rather than in dramatic defense. Over time, as regional stability increased and surrounding towns grew, the fort's role diminished. The same vigilance that had once been critical gradually became unnecessary, and the quiet hum of its routine slowly faded. As the fort's relevance waned, the maintenance of its structures became sporadic. Timber rotted, stone blocks shifted, and ditches partially filled with silt. Tools and supplies were repurposed or scavenged by villagers, leaving only remnants of what had once been a functional installation. Even as the fort fell into neglect, it continued to shape the landscape subtly. Tree lines followed the old ditches, and the soil where walls had stood remained slightly elevated, preserving the memory of human construction. The decline of Blackwood offers a lesson in the impermanence of human institutions. While the fort had once been central to daily life, its quiet disappearance underscores the delicate balance between necessity, labor, and environmental context. Structures that seem permanent can vanish not through dramatic events but through gradual shifts in circumstance, priorities, and population. Blackwood teaches that endurance in history is often contingent, fragile, and subject to the slow accumulation of ordinary pressures. Even amid abandonment, the fort leaves traces of human ingenuity. The layout of ditches, the careful placement of timbers, and the modest storage arrangements reflect thoughtful design suited to local conditions. These remnants speak to centuries of practical knowledge, patience, and observation, revealing a community capable of sustained effort without grandeur or spectacle. In their quiet persistence, the fort's remains tell a story of human life deeply entwined with landscape, labor, and subtle survival strategies. Langthorpe was a modest village, nestled among rolling hills and broad stretches of wheat fields, where the golden stalks swayed gently in the wind. Unlike fortified towns or bustling market centers, Langthorpe was ordinary in every sense: simple cottages, narrow dirt lanes, and fields that had fed generations of villagers. Yet it is remembered not for battles or feasts, but for the quiet mysteries that occasionally fell over its fields, strange disappearances, faint patterns in the crops, and the slow, unsettling sense that the land itself held stories that were almost imperceptible. The village's layout reflected practical necessity. Cottages clustered near the central green, close enough to provide neighbors with company but far enough apart to allow small gardens and livestock pens. The wheat fields stretched outward, punctuated by narrow tracks that connected plots to the village lanes. In the growing season, the fields were alive with activity, villagers tending crops, children running along the paths, and the occasional flock of geese or sheep moving along the edges. Work followed the rhythms of the sun and the soil, a daily cycle of sowing, watering, weeding, and harvesting that defined life in Langthorpe with deliberate regularity. Farming here was not glamorous. Wheat required careful preparation, plowing the soil, sowing seeds in evenly spaced rows, and protecting young plants from pests. Villagers relied on simple tools, wooden plows, sickles, and handheld hoes, and labor was divided according to age, ability, and gender. Everyone had a role. Adults worked the heavier tasks, children gathered weeds, and elders offered guidance and oversight. These tasks were repetitive, often dull, but necessary for survival, and they shaped both the village economy and its social structure. Yet Langthorpe's fields held an air of quiet unease. Historical accounts note that, during certain summers, villagers would report fleeting shadows moving across the wheat, shapes that seemed too deliberate to be the wind alone. Some described glimpses of figures bending among the stalks, disappearing when approached. Others noted subtle disturbances, trampled rows, footprints that did not match any local inhabitant, and patches of soil that seemed unusually compacted. These occurrences were never violent or dramatic, but they lingered in memory, creating a low, persistent sense of mystery. The villagers responded with a mix of caution and curiosity. Some avoided the fields at dawn or dusk, when the shadows seemed most prominent. Others inspected the ground meticulously, attempting to identify the source of disturbances, whether human, animal, or natural. Meetings were held in quiet tones to discuss these anomalies, often concluding with practical measures, repairing fences, adjusting irrigation ditches, or keeping children and livestock closer to home. The response was never panicked, it was deliberate and measured. Reflecting the villagers' reliance on routine and observation to manage uncertainty. Social life in Langthorpe was subtly influenced by these mysterious occurrences. The village green remained a place of gathering, but conversations often circled around the inexplicable shadows and the patterns they created. Villagers speculated in hushed voices about travelers passing through, hidden creatures of the forest, or the peculiarities of wind and sunlight on the waving wheat. No one insisted on dramatic explanations, but the persistent sense of subtle, almost imperceptible disturbance shaped communal awareness and attention. Environmental factors contributed to the phenomenon. The fields themselves were uneven, with low spots that collected moisture and high ridges that caught wind. Light filtering through morning mist or evening haze could create illusions of movement among the wheat stalks. Animals, foxes, hares, or even birds, might disturb crops in ways that appeared deliberate. Yet none of these explanations fully accounted for the accounts recorded in local chronicles, which noted an almost rhythmic pattern to the shadows, a consistency that seemed too precise to be entirely natural. By the late 14th century, Langthorpe had become a place of quiet observation. Villagers adjusted routines to account for the anomalies. Harvests were timed to minimize exposure to shadowy fields, livestock was brought closer to the village at night, and crop inspections were performed more meticulously. These measures were practical, yet they reinforced the sense that the village's ordinary life was subtly intertwined with something larger, something persistent and enigmatic. The wheat fields themselves became a kind of silent companion, a space that demanded attention and careful labor while offering no clear answers. Even the architecture of the village reflected adaptation to these subtle mysteries. Fences were reinforced, storage sheds were positioned near cottages, and paths through the fields were straightened to allow better visibility. The villagers' responses were practical rather than fearful, grounded in a calm understanding that survival required observation and adjustment. This was not heroism, it was ordinary diligence, repeated daily, season after season. And yet, despite centuries of attention, the source of the shadows was never conclusively identified. Scholars, chroniclers, and wandering observers could speculate endlessly: shifting light, wandering animals, human trespassers, or even folkloric imagination. But no single explanation satisfied all accounts. The mystery remained quiet, persistent, and profoundly ordinary, a part of the landscape, integrated into the rhythm of daily labor, shaping decisions and routines without ever dominating them. Bramblewick was a small village tucked into the gentle folds of a rural valley, its name derived from the dense brambles and hedgerows that bordered the fields. Unlike towns recorded for grand battles or political upheaval, Bramblewick's history is a study in quiet endurance and gradual decay, a story of slow changes, minor inconveniences, and the subtle pressures of rural life that accumulated over generations. In its prime, Bramblewick was home to perhaps 70 or 80 people, living in modest timber cottages, each with a small garden and pen for a few animals. Narrow lanes, often muddied by rain, connected the houses and the common green where villagers occasionally gathered. At the center of the settlement was a small communal well, a meeting point for exchange of news, shared labor, and the occasional negotiation over grazing rights or crop access. Life here was structured, repetitive, and reliable, with survival dependent on meticulous attention to mundane tasks rather than dramatic interventions. The economy of Bramblewick was modest but functional. Villagers farmed wheat, barley, and oats, rotated plots carefully to maintain soil fertility, and raised sheep and pigs for both food and trade. Women spun wool, wove cloth, and tended household gardens, while men plowed fields, repaired fences, and performed small-scale carpentry. Children contributed early, learning skills through observation and practice, gradually taking over responsibilities as they grew older. This slow transmission of practical knowledge allowed the village to sustain itself quietly over generations, with the rhythm of daily life guiding each season. Yet, as the 14th century progressed, Bramblewick began to experience subtle pressures that would, over decades, gradually erode its stability. Environmental factors were central. Seasonal flooding occasionally affected low-lying fields, while droughts could reduce harvest yields. Soil, though fertile, required constant attention to prevent depletion. Villagers experimented with crop rotation, irrigation channels, and soil amendments, yet these efforts were labor-intensive and could not always offset natural variability. Survival required patience, observation, and ongoing effort. Economic pressures added another layer of quiet stress. Obligations to the local lord, in the form of tithes, taxes, and labor dues, demanded consistent production and punctual delivery. Shortfalls due to weather, disease, or other minor setbacks created ripple effects, fines, additional labor, or reliance on less efficient subsistence strategies. Trade with neighboring villages and towns provided some flexibility, yet travel was time-consuming and sometimes dangerous, especially during wet seasons when roads became nearly impassable. Small imbalances in productivity could accumulate over years, gradually destabilizing households. Socially, Bramblewick relied on cooperation and shared knowledge. Villagers pooled labor for planting and harvesting, shared tools, and offered assistance during times of minor crisis. Yet even minor conflicts, disputes over land boundaries, inheritance, or livestock, could erode cohesion. Unlike traumatic events, these disagreements were subtle, often resolved quietly, yet their cumulative effect over generations could influence patterns of departure, labor distribution, and communal decision-making. As these pressures accumulated, signs of decline began to emerge slowly. Some cottages were abandoned as families left in search of better opportunities, leaving gardens untended and roofs to sag under the weight of rain and snow. Fences fell into disrepair, allowing livestock to wander, occasionally damaging neighboring fields. The communal well, once carefully maintained, required more effort than the diminished population could reliably provide. Small tasks, once easily managed, became burdensome, and the rhythms of daily life began to stretch and strain under reduced human labor. Historical records suggest that migration was gradual. Young adults, particularly those reaching adolescence, increasingly sought opportunities in nearby towns or larger villages. The promise of steady wages, social mobility, or simply a less labor-intensive lifestyle drew them away from Bramblewick. The departure of younger generations exacerbated the burden on remaining households, forcing them to manage larger plots, repair structures, and maintain livestock with fewer hands. Over decades, the population declined steadily, without dramatic events marking the change. The physical environment mirrored this human decline. Fields previously plowed with care became uneven and overgrown, hedgerows thickened, and drainage ditches filled with silt. Roofs that were once neatly thatched collapsed under winter snows, leaving interiors vulnerable to weather and pests. Even the common green, once the center of quiet social activity, became a tangle of grasses and weeds. Nature reclaimed the space as human oversight diminished, blending the village into the surrounding landscape almost imperceptibly. Bramblewick's story demonstrates that decline need not be dramatic to be historically significant. There was no siege, no famine, no outbreak of violence that ended the village in a single moment. Instead, its disappearance resulted from ordinary, incremental pressures, environmental variability, economic obligations, social shifts, and demographic changes. Each factor, minor in isolation, contributed to a cumulative process that gradually hollowed out both the population and the built environment. By the mid-14th century, Bramblewick's rhythms had begun to shift, though the changes were subtle and almost imperceptible at first. Mornings still began with the crowing of roosters and the soft stirrings of households preparing for the day. But tasks took longer, and small inefficiencies began to accumulate. Fences weakened, paths became muddier, and the communal well required increasing effort to keep clean. These minor inconveniences were ordinary in isolation, yet over decades, they became part of a pattern that quietly eroded the village's stability. Life in Bramblewick was measured in routine. Men tended fields, plowing and sowing in early spring, maintaining ditches, and harvesting in late summer. Women prepared meals, spun wool, cared for livestock, and managed household gardens. Children learned by observation and participation, gradually assuming responsibility for minor tasks and chores. The effectiveness of these routines depended on cooperation and continuity. Any disruption in labor or resources could ripple through the community, slowing work, reducing yields, and creating a sense of accumulated pressure. Environmental factors were a constant source of concern. Seasonal flooding sometimes rendered fields unusable for weeks, washing away topsoil or leaving patches waterlogged. Droughts reduced grain yields, forcing families to ration food or seek trade for additional supplies. Harsh winters, with heavy snowfall, isolated households and made travel to neighboring towns perilous. Villagers adapted incrementally, moving livestock to higher pastures, adjusting crop rotations, or repairing drainage ditches. These measures were effective only to a point, and small failures compounded over time. Economic pressures compounded these environmental challenges. Tithes, taxes, and labor obligations to the local lord required predictable output. A shortfall in grain could lead to fines or additional labor requirements, which in turn taxed already diminished labor capacity. Families compensated by rationing, working longer hours, or borrowing from neighbors. These adjustments, while pragmatic, could not offset the broader pattern of gradual decline. The village was caught in a cycle where effort increased but long-term resilience diminished. Social cohesion, once a stabilizing factor, also began to fray subtly. Minor disputes over land boundaries, inheritance, or livestock became more consequential as the population shrank. Young adults increasingly left Bramblewood for nearby towns or larger villages, seeking steady wages, social mobility, or simply the ease of life in a more populated area. This migration further reduced the village's labor capacity, forcing remaining households to expand their responsibilities. Cooperation, previously routine, required negotiation, compromise, and careful management, turning ordinary tasks into sources of quiet stress. Infrastructure, too, began to fail incrementally. Thatched roofs sagged or developed holes, letting in rain and snow. Timber fences collapsed under seasonal stress. Pathways between fields became uneven, overgrown, and muddy, slowing the movement of people and animals alike. The communal well, once a source of reliability, required constant repair and careful use to avoid contamination. The physical signs of decline mirrored the social and economic strains, reinforcing the sense that the village's stability was gradually unraveling. Even cultural and religious life reflected the slow changes. The small chapel in Bramblewick continued to hold services, yet attendance dwindled as families moved away or became absorbed in subsistence concerns. Feasts, local celebrations, and communal gatherings became less frequent, more subdued, and often improvised. The absence of these rituals weakened social bonds subtly, reducing opportunities for shared experience, mutual oversight, and collective problem solving. In a village dependent on collaboration, even minor reductions in social cohesion could have cumulative consequences. By the late 14th century, the cumulative effect of these ordinary pressures became clear. Fields were less productive, livestock was harder to manage, and buildings required more maintenance than the remaining households could provide. Families who might have once tolerated minor hardships began to leave, seeking opportunities elsewhere. Migration was slow, deliberate, and practical, no dramatic flight, but a steady drift of younger generations toward towns, leaving older adults to manage increasingly unsustainable responsibilities. Interestingly, the historical record indicates attempts to adapt and resist decline. Villagers consolidated plots, pooled labor, repaired buildings, and managed communal resources with care. These efforts demonstrate human resilience and ingenuity even in the face of slow, persistent pressures. Yet, despite these efforts, the underlying dynamics, environmental, economic, demographic, and social, continue to push the village toward contraction. Decline, in this case, was a slow, almost imperceptible process, unfolding over decades rather than months. As you imagine walking through Bramblewick during this period, you notice how every ordinary action, the repair of a fence, the clearing of a drainage ditch, the planting of a new row of grain, was a small measure against an unseen tide of gradual change. The village's decline was not dramatic, violent, or sudden. It was a matter of small pressures accumulating quietly over time, creating conditions in which even ordinary routines became increasingly difficult to maintain. Harthill was once a modest settlement of stone cottages, narrow lanes, and worn cobblestones, quietly tucked into a rolling countryside of pastures and woodlands. Unlike bustling towns known for markets, guilds, or royal visits, Harthill was ordinary in scale and purpose, a village where the rhythms of life were dictated by seasons, labor, and subtle social networks rather than by dramatic events. Yet Harthill's significance lies not in battles or disasters, but in its quiet disappearance over centuries, a slow vanishing that left only traces of cobblestones, a few standing walls, and whispered stories of those who once lived there. The village itself was small, perhaps 50 or 60 households at its peak, arranged along a main lane that meandered past cottages, gardens, and small courtyards. Each household maintained livestock, a kitchen garden, and sometimes a small orchard. Life was structured around the practical needs of subsistence and modest trade, tending fields, repairing homes, preparing food, and maintaining fences. Children learned tasks early, assisting in chores, gathering firewood, and caring for animals. Each generation inherited routines that were familiar, repetitive, and quietly essential for survival. Cobblestone lanes were the central feature of Harthill. Carefully laid by skilled hands, the stones guided foot traffic, aided drainage, and provided a subtle organization to the village's layout. Each step along the lane was deliberate. The uneven stones demanded attention, but they also reflected centuries of care, small innovations, and patient labor. The lanes connected homes, workshops, and communal spaces, allowing movement, communication, and trade to occur reliably, though slowly, in a world without paved roads or wheeled carts. Work in Harthill was persistent and methodical. Farmers plowed and sowed, repaired fences, and tended to animals. Women spun wool, baked bread, and cultivated vegetables. Tradespeople, if any, crafted simple goods, repaired tools, and occasionally traveled to nearby towns to exchange surplus produce. Tasks were repetitive yet essential, requiring attention to detail, careful observation, and consistent effort. Success depended less on extraordinary skill than on steady, unbroken commitment to the ordinary work of daily life. The village also held subtle secrets, whispers that lingered in the local memory. Records note occasional disappearances of individuals or small families, often leaving behind belongings and partially tended plots. Explanations were rarely dramatic: migration to towns, shifts in agricultural viability, or disputes over property may have played a role. Yet the repetition of these vanishings over decades created a quiet mystery, a sense that Harthill, like the gaps between its cobblestones, contained unseen spaces where ordinary life sometimes dissolved into absence. Environmental factors contributed to these disappearances. Soil fatigue, minor flooding, and harsh winters subtly reduced agricultural output, increasing labor demands while diminishing returns. A family facing repeated crop failures might quietly abandon a cottage, relocating to a more fertile area or a larger town. Roads connecting Harthill to the outside world were muddy, uneven, and sometimes impassable, complicating trade and limiting economic resilience. These pressures, ordinary and cumulative, slowly reshaped the village without dramatic announcement. The social structure of Harthill reflected these quiet pressures. Households relied on one another for labor exchange, guidance, and support during minor crises. When families left or children migrated, this social fabric weakened, forcing remaining villagers to compensate for lost labor. Small disputes over land or livestock became more consequential as population declined. Cooperation, once routine and almost automatic, required deliberate negotiation, further straining the community. Even religious and communal life adapted to the village's quiet changes. The small chapel at the center of Harthill continued to hold weekly services, but attendance waned as families departed or prioritized labor over ritual. Seasonal celebrations, once marking planting or harvest, became subdued or skipped entirely. These omissions, though minor, slowly eroded the rhythms that had tied villagers together across generations. The spaces of communal life, the chapel, the green, the cobblestone lanes, remained, but the presence of people was diminished. Over time, Harthill's physical structures began to reflect the social and economic shifts. Roofs sagged, timber beams rotted, and gardens were overtaken by weeds. Cobblestones, once carefully maintained, shifted under weather and neglect, creating uneven paths that slowed travel and subtly signaled the village's declining vitality. Even as structures decayed, they retained hints of the village's careful, persistent labor, the placement of stones, the remnants of walls, the faint outline of gardens, all echoing ordinary efforts repeated over decades. The mystery of Harthill's vanishing is quiet but persistent. Unlike dramatic historical events, there is no single turning point, no siege, famine, or outbreak that ended the village in one moment. Instead, the disappearance occurred gradually, through a combination of ordinary pressures, environmental, economic, demographic, and social. Each departure, each abandoned plot, and each forgotten lane contributed to a process that, over decades, emptied the village without fanfare. By the late 14th century, Harthill's quiet routines had begun to shift, though the changes were gradual and almost imperceptible at first. The village still bustled with daily activity, but the rhythms of work and interaction were increasingly strained by subtle pressures that accumulated over years. Where once tasks had been shared seamlessly across households, labor shortages forced remaining families to extend their responsibilities, creating a cycle of increased effort with diminishing returns. Men worked long hours in the fields, plowing, sowing, and harvesting, while also repairing fences, clearing ditches, and maintaining buildings that were beginning to show the signs of neglect. Women tended the household gardens, spun wool, prepared meals, and cared for livestock. Children, as in generations past, learned by doing, but they were now called upon to assume more substantial responsibilities earlier, assisting in fields, gathering fuel from nearby woods, and overseeing smaller animals. Each household had to absorb more work than it once had, and the daily rhythm, though familiar, required ever greater endurance. Environmental factors remained a persistent influence. Seasonal flooding occasionally submerged the low-lying fields, washing away soil and reducing yields. Droughts and unusually hot summers stressed crops, forcing households to ration food or rely on trade for supplemental supplies. Harsh winters could isolate the village for weeks, making travel to markets or neighboring settlements perilous and further straining local resources. Even small environmental shifts, the timing of rain, the direction of prevailing winds, or minor pest infestations, could significantly influence production in a village where survival depended on steady, predictable output. Economic pressures compounded the environmental challenges. Taxes, tithes, and labor obligations to the local lord required consistent productivity. Families struggling to maintain yields faced difficult decisions, working longer hours, diverting labor from other tasks, or seeking alternative sources of income in nearby towns. These decisions, while practical, placed additional strain on social cohesion, as households competed for limited resources, negotiated labor, and balanced obligations against survival. Social dynamics, which had previously strengthened Harthill's resilience, were gradually altered by depopulation. Young adults increasingly left the village, drawn to towns by opportunities for steady wages, more reliable access to food, or the appeal of community life beyond the narrow confines of Harthill. The departure of these younger generations reduced the pool of available labor, forcing remaining families to manage larger responsibilities. Routine cooperation, essential for planting, harvesting, and maintenance, became less automatic and more deliberate, requiring negotiation, coordination, and patience. Even the village's communal spaces reflected these subtle changes. The small chapel, once a site of shared ritual and minor gatherings, saw declining attendance. Seasonal celebrations, from planting festivals to harvest gatherings, were curtailed or skipped entirely. The communal green, once a space for conversation, barter, and play, became quieter, its edges overgrown with grass and weeds. These shifts, while seemingly minor, altered the fabric of daily life. Rituals and social gatherings, though understated, had previously reinforced community cohesion, offering opportunities for cooperation and mutual oversight. Their diminution quietly weakened the village's social structure. Infrastructure, too, bore the marks of gradual neglect. Cobblestone lanes developed uneven surfaces as stones shifted or sank, slowed by winter frost or rain. Wooden beams rotted, thatched roofs sagged, and small garden plots were overtaken by weeds. Even the communal well required constant attention to remain functional. Each minor failure, uncorrected, compounded the difficulties of daily life, gradually reshaping Harthill into a village where ordinary tasks demanded more effort, and small inefficiencies accumulated into persistent challenges. The result was a slow hollowing of the village. Households that might once have weathered occasional setbacks now struggled to sustain themselves. Some cottages were abandoned, their interiors left untouched, gardens untended, and fences collapsing. Families that remained worked tirelessly to maintain productivity, often consolidating fields or livestock to manage labor constraints. These adaptations demonstrated resilience and ingenuity, yet they could only slow, not prevent, the broader trend of decline. Harthill's story during this period illustrates the subtle power of ordinary pressures. Unlike dramatic events that abruptly reshape history, war, plague, or natural disaster, Harthill's decline was the product of small, incremental forces acting over decades. Environmental stress, economic demands, demographic shifts, and social adjustments collectively eroded the village's vitality, leaving behind only the faint outlines of buildings, cobblestones, and paths as evidence of what had once been. As you walk along the uneven lanes, observing the slowly tilting cottages, the overgrown gardens, and the silent chapel, you realize that every small action, repairing a fence, tending a garden, hauling water from the well, was a measure against an invisible, cumulative force. The villagers' persistence is quietly remarkable, but it also demonstrates how ordinary pressures, if persistent enough, can quietly overwhelm even the most diligent and careful efforts. Red March was a small, unassuming village, modest in size but once modestly lively thanks to its few taverns, modest inns, and the occasional traveling merchant. Nestled at the edge of a gently flowing river and surrounded by rolling pastures, it had no claim to fame in chronicles of war or politics, yet its history reveals a quiet story of decline, of spaces once filled with human presence, laughter, and conversation, gradually emptied by ordinary pressures that unfolded over decades. The taverns of Red March were not grand halls with carved wooden beams and roaring hearths. They were small, functional establishments, often no larger than a single story, with a main room for patrons, a simple hearth for warmth, and a handful of tables for those who wished to share a meal or a drink. Each tavern was family-run. The owner lived upstairs, while family members managed cooking, cleaning, and tending to travelers. These spaces provided essential services for villagers and itinerants alike: food, drink, a place to exchange news, and occasionally a temporary shelter from rain or the long nights of travel. Daily life in and around the taverns was calm and methodical. Villagers visited regularly, often in the evening after long days tending fields, repairing fences, or attending to livestock. Conversation was subdued, focused on practical matters, crop yields, livestock, labor schedules, and minor disputes. Travelers offered news from nearby towns, a rumor of unusual weather, or details of distant fairs. The tavern acted as a hub of slow, deliberate communication, an anchor point for social cohesion, and a space where the rhythm of the village life could be observed and subtly reinforced. Red March's taverns also depended on practical logistics. Supplies of grain for bread, hops for ale, wood for cooking and warmth, and firewood for heating all required careful management. Taverns were often stocked in bulk, purchased from neighboring villages or local markets. Any disruption, a poor harvest, an increase in transport costs, or the departure of a family member to seek work elsewhere, could strain these delicate arrangements. Small failures, unnoticed by outsiders, could accumulate into persistent challenges, slowly undermining the viability of the establishment. The village itself reflected the quiet interdependence between taverns and community. Farmers, craftsmen, and laborers contributed not only to the local economy but also to the subtle maintenance of the social fabric. Taverns were meeting points where obligations were reinforced and informal networks strengthened. Even a simple evening conversation could resolve minor disputes, arrange cooperative work on fields, or coordinate labor for seasonal tasks. The presence of taverns was more than convenience, it was an extension of the social structure that helped maintain order, cooperation, and routine. Yet, over decades, subtle pressures began to affect Red March's taverns. Economic challenges played a central role. If harvests failed or trade routes became less reliable, villagers had less surplus to spend on ale or meals. Traveling merchants, once a source of supplemental income and goods, became less frequent, reducing demand. Even small population shifts, the departure of a young family, the immigration of a skilled craftsperson, gradually reduced the base of regular patrons. Each tavern, though still functional, found itself quieter than before, its rooms filled with fewer conversations, fewer footsteps, and more empty chairs. Environmental factors contributed quietly as well. Harsh winters sometimes isolated the village for weeks, preventing travel and disrupting supplies. Flooded fields or muddy roads hindered both villagers and travelers. Maintenance of the tavern itself required ongoing labor. Thatched roofs had to be repaired, floors swept and oiled, and hearths kept free of soot. Any reduction in labor or increase in strain made these tasks more challenging, and small delays in upkeep subtly reduced the comfort and practicality of the space. Socially, the emptiness of taverns reflected broader shifts in community life. As families departed or prioritized labor over leisure, communal interaction declined. Fewer conversations, fewer gatherings, and fewer opportunities for informal cooperation weakened the subtle bonds that had long structured daily life. The tavern, once a space of practical social cohesion, began to reflect the slow, cumulative effects of depopulation, economic strain, and environmental pressures. Even the architecture of Red March's taverns echoed these changes. Walls once decorated with simple tools, dried herbs, or maps of the local area became bare. Tables and benches, carefully maintained, showed signs of neglect. Hearths were still functional but less tended, and rooms that once smelled of fresh bread, stew, or ale began to carry only the faint echoes of their previous warmth. The spaces remained, but the presence of humans, the life of the village, was increasingly absent. The emptiness was not marked by tragedy or catastrophe, it was gradual and almost imperceptible. Unlike a burning village or a plague-ravaged town, Red March faded quietly. The cumulative effect of ordinary pressures, economic shifts, population changes, environmental challenges, and social adjustments, transformed once bustling spaces into silent rooms, empty tables, and abandoned hearths. By the early 15th century, the quiet decline of Red March's taverns became more noticeable, though it unfolded gradually, without drama or catastrophe. The village remained inhabited, the fields tilled, and livestock tended, yet the taverns, once the central hub of social interaction, were visited less frequently. Patrons arrived at irregular hours, conversations were subdued, and empty chairs outnumbered those occupied. This subtle emptiness reflected a slow erosion of ordinary structures that had maintained both social and practical cohesion in the community. The rhythm of working Red March continued, though it demanded more effort as the population shifted. Fields required constant care, sowing, weeding, irrigating, and harvesting. Villagers repaired fences, maintained roads, and managed livestock. Women continued domestic tasks, baking bread, spinning wool, tending gardens, and occasionally assisting in communal work such as repair of the taverns themselves. Children participated in chores, gradually taking on responsibilities formerly shared across more households. Each generation inherited the labor-intensive routine of village life, but with fewer hands, the same work became more arduous. Taverns, while still operational, increasingly reflected the practical strains of village life. Owners and their families managed all aspects of the establishment, cooking, cleaning, maintaining the hearth, and overseeing small repairs. When patronage was high, these tasks were manageable. When the village population declined, or economic circumstances limited discretionary spending, these responsibilities grew heavier. A hearth that once blazed warmly in the evening might now be poorly tended, benches could be uneven from neglect, the smell of fresh bread and ale became occasional rather than routine. Economic and environmental pressures were tightly intertwined in this period. Crop yields varied due to weather conditions, soil fatigue, or minor floods, affecting both food availability and income for tavern owners. Fewer travelers passed through, and villagers themselves spent less on leisure, redirecting limited resources toward subsistence needs. Supply chains, previously reliable, became more precarious. Shipments of grain, hops, or firewood were delayed or reduced, further stressing the tavern's operations. Even a minor disruption, a muddy road, a failed harvest, or a delayed delivery, could ripple through daily life, subtly reshaping routines. Social dynamics were equally affected. Where once taverns had been central spaces for negotiation, news exchange, and mutual observation, their diminishing use weakened social cohesion. Fewer conversations meant fewer opportunities to coordinate labor, share resources, or resolve disputes informally. Practical cooperation, organizing harvest schedules, repairing fences, or assisting neighbors during illness, required deliberate effort rather than flowing naturally from shared presence. The subtle decline in social interaction mirrored the quieter, less visible decline in physical infrastructure. Even the architecture of the taverns reflected this change. Roofs sagged slightly, the thatch thinning under years of weather, timbers creaked more frequently, floors required more attention to remain navigable. Where once walls had been adorned with simple decorations, herbs hung to dry, maps, or handcrafted tools, they now stood bare. Hearths, once centers of warmth and communal gathering, were maintained minimally, just enough to serve the occasional visitor. The physical decay of the buildings mirrored the slow decline of patronage and social engagement. Despite these pressures, efforts were made to preserve the tavern's functionality. Owners reinforced structures, repaired fences, and occasionally invited neighbors to share meals or assist with maintenance. These acts, while practical, could not reverse broader demographic and economic trends. As younger villagers migrated to towns, and older generations struggled to maintain both livelihoods and infrastructure, the tavern's role as community hubs waned. They became functional but subdued, echoing the rhythms of labor rather than the vibrancy of social life. The cumulative effect of these ordinary pressures created a village that was still inhabited but less lively. The taverns, once spaces of conversation, observation, and quiet coordination, became reflective of the overall decline, quieter, less frequented, and more functional than social. Steps across the worn floors, the occasional sound of a ladle stirring stew, or the subtle creak of a door became reminders that life continued, but in a diminished form. And as evening falls across Red March, casting shadows along the lanes and into the empty taverns, one subtle question lingers: how often does history fade not with dramatic events, but with ordinary pressures that slowly reshape communities, leaving spaces that are physically intact yet socially hollow? How many villages have quietly emptied their communal spaces, leaving only faint echoes of conversations, footsteps, and laughter that once tied neighbors together? Red March's story is a meditation on endurance, ordinary labor, and the subtle passage of time, recorded not in battles or chronicles but in empty hearths, abandoned tables, and the quiet rhythm of daily life persisting amidst change. Greenway Manor was an unassuming estate nestled at the edge of a gently sloping valley, surrounded by modest pastures and groves of oak and beech. Unlike grand castles chronicled in history books for battles or royal visits, Greenway Manor is remembered for its quiet presence, the ordinary rhythms of life within its walls, and the peculiar emptiness that gradually came to define its echoing hall. The manor was never populous, but it functioned as a home, an administrative center for surrounding lands, and a subtle hub of rural social life. The main hall of Greenway Manor was a long, rectangular space with high ceilings supported by exposed beams. Windows, tall but narrow, allowed shafts of light to fall across the worn flagstone floor. The hearth, though large, was more functional than ceremonial, providing warmth and a space to cook simple meals. Furniture was practical: long tables for meals, benches, cupboards, and shelves for everyday necessities. The hall was not designed for spectacle. It was a workspace, a place for dining, administration, and occasional social gatherings, reflecting the manor's understated role in local life. Daily life at Greenway Manor revolved around routine and labor. Servants and household staff performed tasks essential to the functioning of the estate: tending fires, preparing meals, cleaning the hall, and maintaining the surrounding gardens. The lord or lady of the manor managed land leases, supervised farm production, and maintained correspondence with local officials or neighboring estates. Seasonal rhythms, planting, harvesting, and preparation for winter, dominated schedules. The manor operated like a finely tuned machine, quiet in its efficiency, with each participant aware of the ordinary responsibilities that ensured continuity. The hall, in particular, played a central role in coordinating these activities. Meetings with tenants occurred here, contracts and leases were read aloud, and minor disputes were addressed. The space also accommodated small social gatherings, feasts at harvest, celebrations of births, and the occasional visitor from neighboring estates. Yet even during such events, activity was measured and deliberate, a stark contrast to the grandeur or exuberance of courtly halls. The echoing quality of the room amplified sounds, making each footstep, cough, or whispered word linger in the air, reminding all who entered of the manor's quiet scale and understated authority. Over time, the hall began to reflect subtle changes in the estate's fortunes. Greenway Manor, like many small rural estates, relied on steady management, consistent labor, and the surrounding population of tenants to remain viable. Environmental challenges, poor harvests, harsh winters, minor flooding of pastures, placed persistent strain on the manor's operations. Labor shortages, resulting from migration to towns or regional population decline, meant that daily tasks required more effort and coordination. Small inefficiencies, an untended hearth, a delayed repair, a crop shortfall, accumulated slowly, subtly transforming the manor's atmosphere. Economic pressures also played a role. Rental income from tenants, though modest, was critical for maintaining staff, repairing buildings, and purchasing supplies. Any reduction in income had cascading effects: fewer servants available to tend fires or clean, repairs postponed, and a reduction in the quality of provisions. Even small shifts in the local economy, fluctuations in grain prices, reduced trade with nearby villages, or the occasional delayed payment from tenants, introduced stress into the manor's routine. These pressures were cumulative, quiet, and persistent, reflected in the increasingly empty and echoing hall. Socially, the hall's emptiness mirrored subtle changes in the manor's population and routines. Visitors became less frequent, tenants spent more time in their own cottages, and celebrations occurred with diminishing regularity. The hall remained physically intact, yet it gradually lost the vibrancy of earlier years. The echoing floor amplified silence as much as sound, highlighting the absence of activity and underscoring the slow passage of time. Even ordinary sounds, footsteps of a servant, the scraping of a chair, the faint closing of a cupboard, resonated in a space increasingly defined by quiet rather than conversation. By the late 14th century, Greenway Manor's hall had become a symbol of subtle transition. It retained its functional purpose: meetings could still be held, meals prepared, and basic administration conducted, but it also reflected the long-term effects of ordinary pressures, labor shortages, environmental stress, economic fluctuation, and gradual social change. The manor, like many rural estates, had not been abandoned abruptly, yet its central spaces were quieter, slower, and more introspective than they had once been. Even so, the hall carried traces of human care and attention. The arrangement of furniture, the placement of tables and benches, and the lingering warmth of a well-tended hearth all spoke to centuries of ordinary labor and management. It was a record not of dramatic events, but of quiet persistence, careful coordination, and the accumulation of mundane effort that allowed the manor to function through changing circumstances. By the early 15th century, the echoing hall of Greenway Manor had become a quieter, more deliberate space. Its physical structure remained sturdy, but the atmosphere was increasingly defined by the absence of vibrant activity. Life continued in measured rhythms, yet the cumulative pressures of labor, population shifts, and environmental constraints were becoming apparent in the very air of the hall. Each footstep, each whispered conversation, now seemed amplified by the silence that had grown over decades. Daily routines remained central to the manor's functioning, but they demanded more effort from fewer people. Servants worked longer hours to maintain essential functions, tending fires, preparing meals, cleaning floors, and repairing minor structural damage. Household chores were repeated with precision, ensuring the manor remained habitable. Yet the lack of sufficient labor slowed every task. The lord or lady of the manor oversaw the estate, visiting fields, inspecting buildings, and coordinating tenants, but even these minor administrative duties were more burdensome as fewer hands were available to implement their instructions. The hall itself reflected these subtle challenges. Meals, once communal and lively, were quieter and more restrained. The long tables that had accommodated visitors and staff were now often partially empty. The hearth, while functional, was stoked less frequently, creating uneven warmth that made the space feel chillier than before. Even the act of gathering, whether for discussion, meal, or administrative matters, required more planning and deliberation, as the reduced population meant that schedules had to be carefully coordinated to ensure participation. Environmental pressures continued to influence life in the manor. Winter snows occasionally blocked access to nearby roads, isolating the estate for days or even weeks. Seasonal flooding sometimes affected fields, reducing yields and straining food supplies. Soil fatigue, minor pest infestations, and unpredictable weather patterns placed constant demands on the manor's agricultural operations. These factors forced the household to conserve resources, prioritize essential labor, and carefully plan for periods when the land might fail to provide adequately. Each decision, though mundane, carried long-term consequences for the survival and comfort of the estate's inhabitants. Economic pressures intertwined with environmental factors to create cumulative strain. The manor's income, derived from rents, labor dues, and agricultural production, fluctuated with crop yields and tenant stability. If a tenant defaulted on rent due to poor harvests, the manor faced both an immediate shortfall and a longer-term reduction in workforce availability. Supplies for daily living, grain, firewood, tools, required careful management, and any disruption necessitated adjustments in routine. These pressures, ordinary on the surface, subtly reshaped both the manor's operations and the experience of life within the echoing hall. Social dynamics also contributed to the hall's increasing quietness. Young adults and skilled workers often left the manor for towns or larger settlements, seeking steadier wages or more social opportunities. Their absence reduced both the labor pool and the vibrancy of daily interaction. The hall, previously a hub of discussion and coordination, now hosted fewer meetings, fewer visitors, and fewer communal meals. Each sound, footsteps, a door creaking, the scraping of a chair, was echoed more sharply against the walls, emphasizing absence rather than presence. Despite these pressures, the manor's inhabitants demonstrated a quiet persistence. The hall remained organized, fires were lit, tables cleaned, and floors swept. Repairs to benches, windows, and the hearth were undertaken with diligence. The inhabitants' efforts reflect ordinary resilience, not heroic in the sense of grand historical events, but vital in maintaining continuity. Their labor was deliberate, repeated, and attentive, sustaining the manor even as its social energy diminished. Over time, the echoing hall became a symbol of subtle transition. Its physical form persisted, yet the social and emotional presence within it had begun to wane. The walls contained stories of generations of careful labor, measured conversation, and routine coordination. Yet with fewer inhabitants and diminishing social interaction, the hall's character shifted from vibrant to reflective, quiet, and contemplative. It became a space where the passage of time could be observed in small details: the creak of a timber, the faint warmth of a hearth, the dust settling in corners rarely disturbed. By now, the manor's rhythms emphasized endurance over vitality. Life continued, yet in a quieter, more deliberate form, where survival required careful attention to ordinary tasks rather than engagement in communal celebration. The hall remained the heart of the estate, but its echoing emptiness highlighted the gradual effects of demographic, economic, and environmental pressures, illustrating how ordinary forces can shape history as powerfully as dramatic events. And as you stand in the center of Greenway Manor's hall, hearing each sound resonate against the high ceiling, one question remains: how many estates, manors, and households throughout history experienced a similar quiet transformation, where ordinary pressures accumulated, life persisted, and spaces once lively gradually became reflective, echoing, and subdued? Greenway Manor reminds us that history often unfolds in subtle ways, recorded not in chronicles of battles or disasters, but in the patient rhythms of daily life, careful labor, and spaces that quietly witness the passage of time. Oldley was a small village, barely more than a cluster of cottages and modest farms, nestled between gentle hills and low-lying meadows. Its story is not marked by battles, royal decrees, or political intrigue, but by the quiet disappearance of labor, the subtle unraveling of daily life, and the gradual reclamation of human spaces by nature. The village's name survives in old records and maps, yet by the 15th century, the sight of tilled fields, tended gardens, and inhabited homes was becoming increasingly rare. At its height, Oldley supported perhaps 100 people, living in timber-framed cottages with thatched roofs and small plots of land for vegetables, grains, and herbs. Farmers worked the surrounding fields, raising wheat, barley, and oats, while tending livestock that included sheep, pigs, and a few cows. Women maintained the households, prepared meals, spun wool, and helped care for animals. Children learned practical skills early, gradually assuming responsibility for chores and tasks that sustained village life. Each season brought predictable work: sowing in spring, tending crops through summer, harvesting in autumn, and preparing for winter with care and planning. The village's economy was modest but functional. Families exchanged surplus produce, occasionally bartered with nearby settlements, and paid tithes to the local lord. Trade was limited, travel was slow, and self-sufficiency remained a necessity. Every household contributed to the broader rhythm of survival, relying on collective knowledge passed down over generations. Oldley was a community sustained not by grandeur or wealth, but by the steady diligence of ordinary labor. Yet subtle pressures began to affect the village over decades. Environmental factors, though never catastrophic in isolation, gradually shaped the future of Oldley. Poor harvests due to heavy rains, early frosts, or minor floods strained household reserves. Soil, worn from continuous use, required careful management, rotation, and rest periods. A single failed harvest did not destroy the village, but repeated difficulties gradually eroded resilience. Families who could afford to relocate often chose to do so, seeking more reliable land or opportunities in nearby towns. Economic pressures intersected with these environmental challenges. Taxes, tithes, and labor obligations were constant requirements. Families experiencing crop shortfalls faced penalties or additional duties to compensate. Even minor disruptions, such as delays in grain transport or shortages in traded goods, introduced tension into daily life. Each household was forced to allocate labor carefully, often working longer hours for diminishing returns, subtly reshaping the village's patterns of work and social interaction. Socially, Oldley depended on cohesion and cooperation. Neighbors shared labor for planting and harvesting, assisted with fence repairs, and helped care for sick or aging villagers. Yet as younger adults migrated to towns in search of wages or stability, these social bonds weakened. Tasks that had once been routine became burdensome, disputes over land or livestock grew more consequential, and the informal networks that supported village life began to fray. Oldley was not abandoned suddenly. It was gradually depopulated, each departure quietly affecting the remaining households. The physical landscape mirrored these social and economic shifts. Fields once neatly plowed and sown became uneven. Fallow patches emerged, and overgrown hedgerows crept along boundaries. Roofs sagged under the weight of snow or neglect, fences collapsed, and livestock wandered into overgrown meadows. Even the village paths, once well-trodden, were soon lined with tall grasses and wildflowers. Nature slowly reclaimed the spaces that had once been cultivated and carefully maintained. Oldley's decline was not dramatic or sudden. There was no fire, no plague, no raid that destroyed the village in a single moment. Instead, it was the result of ordinary pressures accumulating over decades: environmental stress, economic strain, migration, and the erosion of communal labor. The departure of a family here, the abandonment of a field there, eventually transformed the village from a lively settlement into a landscape of quiet traces. Oldley's story is a meditation on the patient persistence of ordinary challenges and the subtle power of human absence. Even as life diminished, the villagers who remained adapted quietly. Fields were consolidated, homes repaired as best they could, and labor shared among fewer hands. These adaptations prolonged continuity but could not reverse long-term trends. The village's rhythm slowed, echoing the diminishing population, and everyday tasks became more arduous. Each harvest, each repair, each meal prepared required deliberate effort, and the ordinary diligence of daily life became a measure of resilience rather than prosperity. Walking through Oldley during this period, one might notice the interplay of persistence and absence: a half-dented garden, a fence leaning with age, a roof patched in haste. Each detail is a testament to human endurance in the face of gradual pressures. And yet, the quiet encroachment of grass, weeds, and wildflowers offers a reminder that even the most carefully managed human spaces eventually yield to natural rhythms. By the early 15th century, Oldley had already begun to feel the effects of gradual depopulation, though life continued in quiet, measured rhythms. The village was still inhabited, but each season required more effort, patience, and coordination than before. Where once fields had been plowed efficiently by numerous hands, labor shortages now slowed every task. Families consolidated plots, combining smaller fields to maximize productivity, yet even these measures could not fully compensate for the absence of workers. Daily life became a careful balancing act. Men and women labored longer hours to maintain essential functions: plowing, sowing, harvesting, repairing buildings, and caring for livestock. Children were pressed into responsibilities earlier, assisting with chores that had once been shared among more adults. Every household was forced to adapt to a shrinking labor pool, emphasizing endurance, patience, and careful planning over speed or abundance. Ordinary routines, gathering firewood, mending fences, tending gardens, grew heavier, and even minor disruptions demanded attention to avoid cascading effects on the village's fragile equilibrium. Environmental pressures continued to shape the rhythm of life in Oldley. Soil fatigue reduced yields, minor floods washed away small plots of grain, and early frosts or prolonged dry spells sometimes spoiled harvests. Livestock required additional care during harsh winters, and fences that were neglected in busier seasons had to be repaired to prevent animals from wandering into neighboring plots. These cumulative pressures tested the resilience of the remaining population, requiring constant vigilance and careful coordination to maintain even minimal productivity. Economic realities compounded these challenges. The village relied on rent from tenants, trade with nearby settlements, and modest surpluses from the fields. A shortfall in harvests or a failure of tenants to pay rent reduced resources, forcing families to make difficult choices. Sometimes food was rationed, repairs postponed, or labor reprioritized to ensure survival rather than comfort or aesthetic upkeep. Even small adjustments, like delaying the repair of a roof or leaving a field fallow, had long-term consequences that accumulated quietly over decades. Social dynamics, once a source of resilience, gradually weakened as the population declined. Neighbors who had previously coordinated labor for planting, harvesting, or repairing infrastructure were now fewer in number. Informal networks of mutual assistance diminished, leaving each household more isolated. Disputes over land boundaries, livestock, or inheritance became more consequential, requiring careful negotiation. The village's social cohesion, subtle and taken for granted in more populous times, became fragile, and every departure of a family or young adult created ripples that altered the village's rhythm. Even the physical layout of Oldley reflected these pressures. Fields became uneven, some overgrown with weeds or wildflowers. Cottages showed signs of disrepair, with sagging roofs and leaning walls, and paths between homes grew narrow, lined with encroaching grasses. Livestock wandered farther afield, sometimes grazing in untended meadows, reflecting the practical limits of reduced labor. The village, while still inhabited, had begun to transform visually as well as socially. The slow reclamation of human spaces by nature was evident in every corner. Remarkably, despite these challenges, the remaining villagers demonstrated subtle ingenuity and resilience. Fields were consolidated, labor shared strategically, and repairs prioritized to maintain basic functionality. Meals were prepared with care from limited ingredients, and livestock was managed in small but sustainable numbers. Every act of maintenance, every routine chore, was a quiet testament to endurance, persistence, and adaptation in the face of cumulative pressures. Even community rituals were adapted to reflect the village's changing population. Seasonal celebrations became smaller, more pragmatic, or occasionally skipped entirely. Religious gatherings, while still held, saw declining attendance, reflecting both the reduced population and the prioritization of labor over leisure. Social bonds, though weakened, were preserved in careful, deliberate interactions rather than in spontaneous communal gatherings. The village's cohesion had not disappeared, but it had shifted from effortless routine to careful, deliberate practice. The cumulative effect of these ordinary pressures, environmental, economic, and social, was increasingly evident in Oldley. The village was neither abandoned nor destroyed, it simply became quieter, slower, and more deliberate. The fields, though still cultivated, demanded ever greater effort from fewer hands. The cottages, though still standing, required constant attention. And the village's social fabric, once reinforced by cooperation and shared labor, now relied on deliberate planning and negotiation to survive. Walking through Oldley during this period, one would notice both resilience and absence. The careful repair of a fence, the deliberate clearing of weeds, and the measured preparation of meals all testified to human ingenuity and endurance. Yet at the same time, the overgrown plots, sagging cottages, and quiet pathways remind the observer that the village is slowly yielding to the cumulative pressures of time, labor, and environment. Every step is a reminder of the subtle, patient forces that shape human settlements, often without dramatic events or clear turning points. In the quiet countryside of medieval England, small villages and hamlets depended on a delicate network of natural water sources, wells, ponds, streams, and occasional springs. These features, often unremarkable to an outsider, were essential for daily life. They provided drinking water, supported livestock, irrigated small gardens, and occasionally supplied mills. Yet over centuries, some wells fell out of use, ponds dried, and springs were diverted, leaving landscapes dotted with forgotten traces of human reliance on water. This story focuses on such places, where the ordinary ebb and flow of life gradually ceased, leaving subtle mysteries etched into the countryside. The wells of these villages were simple constructions, circular stone rings, sometimes reinforced with timber, covering a vertical shaft dug into the earth until it reached a reliable water table. A bucket, rope, and pulley system were often sufficient to draw water for a household or small community. Maintenance was essential. Stones had to be realigned, the shaft cleared of debris, and ropes replaced as they frayed. These structures were rarely remarkable, yet they were vital lifelines, quietly sustaining human settlements that might otherwise have been impossible. Ponds, often man-made, served multiple purposes. Some were primarily for watering livestock, their surfaces reflecting the seasons as animals came to drink. Others supported small-scale fish farming, providing both nutrition and modest income. Many were used in irrigation, directing water to vegetable plots or fields in dry seasons. Ponds required maintenance too. Embankments had to be reinforced, channels cleared, and vegetation managed to prevent overgrowth or stagnation. Like wells, they were largely invisible in the historical record, Yet they shaped the daily lives and survival strategies of countless villagers. In some cases, wells and ponds fell out of use for practical reasons. Shifts in population, migration, or economic patterns often led to certain houses or farms being abandoned. If fewer people relied on a well, maintenance became sporadic, and it could gradually deteriorate. Similarly, ponds could dry if their inflow was disrupted or if surrounding fields were repurposed. Over time, these changes altered not only the landscape but also the social structure. Gatherings by the water source declined, livestock had to be relocated, and routines that had once been predictable became uncertain. Environmental factors also played a subtle but decisive role. Minor changes in soil composition, the course of a stream, or rainfall patterns could affect water availability. A well that once produced plentiful water might slow as the water table dropped, requiring extra effort to draw sufficient supplies. Ponds could shrink in dry summers or silt up over years, eventually losing their functionality. These small, almost imperceptible changes shaped everyday decisions: which water source to use, how often to maintain it, or whether to relocate livestock. The human response to these pressures demonstrates quiet ingenuity. Villagers improvised, digging new wells, reinforcing old ponds, or redirecting small streams. Yet even these measures were constrained by labor, resources, and knowledge. The people who depended on these water sources understood that failure was cumulative. A poorly maintained well today could mean hardship tomorrow. A neglected pond could compromise livestock health or crop yields. Every small decision carried practical consequences, recorded not in official documents but in the rhythms of daily work and observation. As some wells fell into disuse, the community adapted subtly. Water collection routines shifted, new paths were formed, and livestock was guided to more reliable sources. The social life once centered on water, conversations while drawing buckets, cooperative work to repair pond embankments, shared observation of seasonal changes, gradually diminished. Spaces once full of ordinary activity became quiet, echoing, and occasionally overgrown. These changes were neither catastrophic nor dramatic, yet they transformed both landscape and village life in ways that persisted for generations. Similarly, ponds and small reservoirs, once vital for irrigation and sustenance, were slowly reclaimed by nature. Grass and reeds overtook the embankments, shallow water evaporated during summer, and silt accumulated, making them less functional. Children who once played along pond edges and farmers who once guided livestock to the water learned to navigate alternative routines, adapting to incremental environmental change. The visual and social landscape shifted subtly, leaving only faint traces, depressions in fields, moss-covered stones, or scattered remnants of timber posts marking old wells. In historical records, these changes are often overlooked. Chronicles rarely mention a well running dry or a pond slowly filling with silt. Yet for the villagers, each forgotten or neglected water source shaped the contours of daily life. Labor increased as water had to be carried further. Crop yields were subtly affected by altered irrigation. Livestock required more attention to maintain health. Ordinary survival depended not on dramatic events, but on the constant negotiation of these small, cumulative pressures. Walking through such landscapes today, one might notice the faint outlines of old wells or shallow ponds, often indicated only by a depression in the earth or a ring of stones peeking through grass. These remnants are silent witnesses to centuries of ordinary effort, subtle adaptation, and human persistence. They invite reflection on the quiet forces that shape life and the environment, forces that often leave no record except in the small, almost imperceptible changes to landscape and routine. Middleton on the Hill was a modest village perched on a gentle rise overlooking the surrounding pastures and meadows. Its distinguishing feature was a small stone church, modest in design but central to the rhythm of village life. The church's bell, hanging in a simple wooden belfry, had rung for generations, marking the hours, signaling gatherings, calling villagers to prayer, and occasionally tolling for moments of sorrow or celebration. Yet over the centuries, the sound of the bell became a rarer presence, a quiet marker of the village's slow transformation. The bell itself was unremarkable in size, made of bronze with faint inscriptions of donors and dates, a modest gift from a local family generations prior. Its deep, resonant tone carried across fields, through meadows, and into cottages, establishing a subtle auditory rhythm for the village. Villagers relied on the bell not only for religious purposes but also as a practical marker, signaling the start of labor in the fields, announcing meal times, or warning of minor emergencies such as fire or flooding. The sound was both functional and symbolic, a small, steady force tying individuals to shared routines. Daily life in Middleton on the Hill revolved around the church and the surrounding agricultural landscape. Families tended fields of barley, oats, and wheat, cared for small herds of livestock, and maintained gardens that supplemented their diets. Women managed households, prepared meals, spun wool, and often assisted in communal labor such as repairing fences or supporting seasonal harvests. Children learned the rhythms of farm life early, assisting with chores and gradually taking on responsibilities as their elders aged or moved. The village's routines were intertwined with the steady tolling of the bell, providing both a practical signal and a subtle emotional anchor. Maintenance of the bell was a quiet but essential task. Ropes frayed from constant use, wooden supports weathered over decades, and the bronze itself required periodic inspection to ensure structural integrity. A mismanaged rope could snap, the clapper could become misaligned, or the belfry's timbers could weaken, reducing the bell's reach or risking damage. These details were not recorded in official chronicles but were central to the villagers' daily life. Every tug of the rope and every swing of the bell carried both practical importance and centuries of accumulated attention and care. Over time, subtle pressures began to reduce the bell's role in village life. Population shifts, economic constraints, and environmental challenges all contributed to a gradual reduction in activity around the church. Younger villagers increasingly migrated to nearby towns for trade, employment, or social opportunity. Families who remained often faced labor shortages, forcing them to prioritize food production, repairs, and survival over ceremonial or routine tasks. As fewer people attended services or gathered in the churchyard, the bell's regular tolling became intermittent, a quieter echo of a once central presence. Environmental factors further shaped this decline. Harsh winters sometimes delayed travel to the church, summer droughts affected fields and water supply, and storms occasionally damaged the belfry. Each minor event required labor to repair and maintain, often pulling focus from other essential tasks. When combined with economic strain and population decline, these pressures made the maintenance and regular use of the bell less consistent. The once steady rhythm of sound became irregular, punctuated by absences that reflected broader shifts in village life. Socially, the bell's diminishing presence affected routines and cohesion. The church had long served as a central meeting place, where villagers exchanged news, coordinated work, and marked social events. As fewer people attended services, celebrated milestones, or convened for gatherings, the bell's role as a social anchor diminished. Ordinary, everyday life continued, but the auditory markers that had once tied families and neighbors together were fading. The sound of the bell, once a subtle guide and comfort, became a rare reminder of past rhythms and shared practices. Physical evidence of change was also apparent. The belfry, though still standing, showed signs of wear. Timbers creaked under wind, rope frayed at the edges, and the bell itself bore a slight patina from decades without routine polishing. The interior of the church was quieter, pews less worn, floors swept less frequently, and candles burned only for necessary services. These subtle alterations reflect the quiet, cumulative pressures acting on the village and its institutions, a slow fading rather than abrupt abandonment. Walking through Middleton on the Hill during this period, one would notice the interplay of persistence and absence. Villagers still tended fields, maintained homes, and observed rituals, yet the steady rhythm once provided by the bell was less reliable. The air carried faint echoes of the past, a clapper striking the bronze, footsteps ascending the narrow stairs of the belfry, the murmured voices of those attending occasional services. These sounds reminded observers of the patient endurance required to maintain continuity in the face of subtle, ordinary pressures. In medieval villages, the hearth was more than just a place to cook food or provide warmth. It was the heart of the household. From small cottages to modest manors, the hearth structured daily life, serving as a gathering point for families, a space for children to learn domestic skills, and a source of comfort during cold winters. Yet over the centuries, some hearths, once central to life, were abandoned, neglected, or left unlit, becoming silent reminders of vanished households and shifting patterns of rural life. The design of a typical hearth was straightforward but essential. Stone or brick floors contained the fire, while a chimney or hood directed smoke away from living spaces. Around the hearth, families arranged benches or stools for warmth and meals. Cooking was often accomplished with simple tools: iron pots suspended over the flames, spits for roasting, and pans for boiling or baking. Even the smallest households relied on this central fire not only for sustenance but for social and emotional cohesion. The crackle of flames, the smell of cooking, and the warmth of the fire were markers of life, routine, and community. Daily use of the hearth followed a rhythm that mirrored the seasons. In winter, fires burned almost constantly, providing warmth in drafty homes and allowing for the preparation of hot meals. In warmer months, hearths were maintained primarily for cooking. The fire required constant attention. Wood had to be gathered, chopped, and stored, ashes removed, and flames carefully tended to prevent accidents. Households coordinated these tasks, often involving children and extended family in a carefully choreographed routine that ensured both sustenance and safety. Yet not all hearths endured. Economic and demographic pressures slowly altered patterns of habitation and maintenance. Families that could no longer sustain themselves on small plots of land often migrated to towns or larger villages. Some homes were abandoned, leaving hearths without tending, slowly cooling and growing silent. Others were maintained by fewer individuals, whose labor could only cover essential cooking and heating, leaving parts of the hearth or its surrounding structures neglected. Over time, these fires burned less frequently, until some hearths were extinguished permanently. Environmental conditions further shaped the persistence, or disappearance, of hearths. Harsh winters placed extraordinary demands on fuel supplies, while damp conditions could cause structural damage to chimneys, hearthstones, and flues. Minor structural problems, left unattended, could render a hearth unsafe or unusable. Additionally, as forests and wood supplies diminished locally due to over-harvesting or competition, fuel became scarce, prompting households to limit fire use or abandon secondary hearths altogether. What had once been the warm center of domestic life could become an unused relic, cold and silent. Social factors also contributed to the decline of hearths. Villages were not static. Labor migration, population decline, and shifting economic patterns reduced the number of households that could maintain fires consistently. Smaller families or single occupants often lacked the labor to keep multiple hearths functioning. Communal efforts, such as shared firewood collection or mutual aid during harsh winters, were less feasible in depopulated or scattered communities. Hearths that once provided warmth and social cohesion became reminders of what had been lost, spaces intended for collective living now standing as silent, unheeded witnesses. The decline of hearths was gradual and rarely dramatic. There was no sudden catastrophe that extinguished them. Instead, ordinary pressures, economic strain, labor shortages, environmental challenges, and migration, combined over decades to leave certain hearths forever cold. Some were intentionally abandoned as families consolidated homes, while others were simply neglected, their wood piles depleted, chimneys crumbling, and stones settling unevenly over time. The sound of crackling flames, once a comforting presence, vanished, replaced by silence and the faint echoes of past domestic life. Physical traces of these hearths persist. Stone or brick foundations remain in cottages, often overgrown with grass or moss. Ashes may linger, compacted and darkened by centuries of weather. Soot marks on chimneys or walls indicate former use, while the surrounding space, benches, hearthstones, and cooking implements, offer silent testimony to daily routines that no longer occur. These traces invite reflection on ordinary survival, persistence, and the patient work required to maintain life in medieval villages. Even as hearths fell silent, the people who remained adapted their routines. Smaller fires were maintained in a single room rather than multiple hearths. Communal gathering spaces, such as a neighbor's home or the village hall, substituted for domestic warmth, and cooking schedules were altered to maximize fuel efficiency. These adaptations prolonged human habitation, even as individual hearths ceased to serve their original purpose. The decline of each hearth illustrates the interplay of environment, labor, and economy, a subtle, cumulative history written not in chronicles but in fireless stones and cooling chimneys. Elmstead was once a modest market village, known not for grandeur or political importance but for its weekly gatherings where villagers and itinerant traders exchanged goods, news, and occasional gossip. The market square, a roughly paved open space at the heart of the village, was framed by timber-framed shops, simple cottages, and the occasional inn or tavern. Market days brought life, color, and noise, the clatter of wooden carts, the braying of livestock, and the murmur of conversation as goods changed hands. Yet over time, Elmsted's market faded, leaving the square quieter than it had ever been. The weekly market was central to both economic and social life. Farmers brought produce, wheat, barley, vegetables, and eggs, while craftsmen offered pottery, tools, and textiles. Local bakers, butchers, and millers relied on the market for income, selling surplus or exchanging goods for services they could not produce themselves. For villagers, attending the market was not only practical but social. It was a place to meet neighbors, exchange news, and negotiate minor disputes. The market's rhythms, arrival at dawn, the busy hours before noon, and the gradual winding down in the afternoon, structured life beyond individual households, reinforcing communal patterns of work, trade, and interaction. The physical layout of the market was practical rather than ornamental. Wooden stalls lined the square, with simple coverings to protect goods from rain or sun. Merchants displayed baskets of vegetables, sacks of grain, and bundles of wool, arranging items to attract attention without the need for sophistication. Inns or taverns on the square provided resting points for visitors and buyers, offering ale, simple meals, and spaces to discuss local matters. Even the streets leading to the market were functional, compacted dirt or rough stone paths that allowed wagons, livestock, and pedestrians to converge efficiently on the central square. Life in Elmstead was tied closely to seasonal cycles. Market activity fluctuated with harvests, weather, and religious festivals. During peak seasons, the square was bustling. During winter or rainy periods, attendance dwindled, and merchants adjusted the types of goods offered accordingly. Trade was modest but essential, sustaining both household economies and broader village cohesion. The market's existence depended on predictable attendance, sufficient produce, and the availability of merchants who could travel between villages with their goods. Yet subtle pressures began to erode the vitality of Elmsted's market. Population decline, labor shortages, and migration to towns all reduced the number of participants. Some merchants found it less profitable to travel to Elmstead when neighboring towns offered larger crowds or more lucrative opportunities. Villagers, focusing on subsistence, increasingly prioritized labor over attending market days. Even minor disruptions, poor harvests, unusually heavy rain, or blocked roads, could reduce attendance and limit transactions. These ordinary pressures accumulated over decades, gradually hollowing the market's rhythm. Economic changes also played a role. The rise of nearby markets or trade centers shifted commerce away from Elmstead. Merchants invested their limited time and capital where returns were more predictable, leaving Elmstead with fewer goods and fewer buyers. Local artisans and producers, facing reduced foot traffic, either adapted by traveling themselves or reduced production, further weakening the market's appeal. Over time, the square became quieter, stalls less colorful, and the once familiar bustle of trade diminished to occasional footsteps and muted conversation. Social consequences accompanied economic decline. The market had served as a locus for informal information exchange, news from neighboring villages, announcements of births or deaths, and minor legal or land negotiations. As attendance waned, so did these forms of communication. Villagers had to rely on letters, messengers, or sporadic visits to maintain connections. The reduction of shared social space subtly weakened cohesion, leaving Elmstead quieter, its square less alive, and its role in the surrounding region diminished. Even the physical appearance of the square reflected this slow vanishing. Wooden stalls, once erected weekly, were fewer in number. The occasional empty platform bore witness to decline. Grass and weeds crept between paving stones, and the sound of hoofs or carts echoed more sharply against the walls of shops and cottages, highlighting absence rather than activity. The square, though intact, was quieter, reflective, and subtly melancholic, a visual record of the slow ebb of ordinary life. By the mid-15th century, Elmstead's market, while not entirely defunct, had become a faint echo of its former self. Attendance was irregular, transactions minimal, and the once regular rhythms disrupted. Merchants came less frequently, villagers were selective in their visits, and the vibrancy that had characterized market days was reduced to a subdued cadence. The square remained, but it now bore witness to absence rather than abundance, to routine rather than spectacle. In the quiet countryside of medieval England, the ordinary infrastructure of daily life, fences, paths, and roads, shaped both human activity and the rhythms of rural communities. These elements were often unremarkable in historical records, yet they were essential for organizing fields, directing livestock, and connecting villages. Over time, however, some fences fell into disrepair, and roads, once trodden daily by villagers and merchants, grew silent and overgrown. Their decline is a subtle story of persistence, adaptation, and the slow passage of time. Fences were the lifeblood of rural organization. Simple wooden stakes, wattled constructions, or low stone walls delineated property, kept livestock contained, and protected crops from wandering animals. Maintaining fences was routine but essential labor. Timbers needed replacement, posts reset, and repairs made after storms or floods. Children and adults alike contributed to these tasks, learning the rhythms of care and the practical importance of boundaries from an early age. Fences define not only property lines but also the spatial rhythm of village life, marking the edges of fields, pastures, and gardens in quiet, persistent patterns. Roads, by contrast, connected villages and shaped trade, communication, and social interaction. Often simple dirt paths compacted by centuries of foot traffic, wagon wheels, and livestock, they were maintained through communal labor. Potholes were filled, embankments reinforced, and drainage ditches dug to prevent flooding. Roads were also social spaces. Travelers met neighbors, exchanged news, or coordinated work for nearby farms. Their use reflected the pulse of ordinary life, linking households, markets, and fields into an interdependent web of activity. Yet both fences and roads were vulnerable to subtle pressures. Labor shortages, migration, and declining populations made maintenance increasingly difficult. When fewer hands were available, routine repairs were delayed or neglected. Storms, frost, and heavy rain accelerated decay, while the cumulative effects of minor damage gradually transformed functional fences into crumbling barriers and trodden paths into overgrown tracks. The landscape, once orderly and predictable, slowly yielded to the forces of time and nature. Economic factors also contributed to the slow decline. Villages with reduced agricultural output or diminished tenant populations had less incentive or fewer resources to maintain infrastructure. Timber was precious. Repairing fences required both labor and materials, which might be prioritized for more immediate survival needs such as building repairs or firewood. Roads connecting depopulated villages were traveled less frequently, reducing the communal impetus to repair them. Over time, ordinary economic and demographic pressures reshaped both the built and natural environment, leaving traces of care alongside signs of neglect. Socially, the effects were equally subtle. Fences that once provided security and clarity of property boundaries became unreliable, leading to occasional disputes over wandering livestock or encroached plots. Roads that had facilitated gatherings, markets, and cooperative labor now carried fewer travelers, weakening social ties and reducing the frequency of interactions that had once structured communal life. The decline of these ordinary structures reflects broader changes in rural life, labor scarcity, migration, and the patient accumulation of pressures that quietly reshape both the landscape and social networks. The visual impact of crumbling fences and silent roads is striking when observed closely. Wooden stakes lean at irregular angles, wattle fences sag or disintegrate, and stone walls collapse in sections where maintenance has lapsed. Roads, once clearly defined by the passage of feet, carts, and hooves, are partially overgrown with grass, weeds, or small shrubs. These transformations are gradual, almost imperceptible from day to day, but they accumulate over decades, marking the slow erosion of human presence and activity. Even in decline, the traces of past labor remain instructive. A partially intact fence demonstrates construction techniques and materials used centuries ago. An overgrown road reveals the paths once trodden by villagers and merchants alike. These remnants are silent witnesses to the patient labor required to sustain ordinary life, emphasizing endurance rather than trauma. They offer lessons about adaptation, persistence, and the quiet forces that shape human settlements over time. In some cases, these neglected structures were repurposed or partially reclaimed by remaining inhabitants. Collapsed fences might be used for firewood or simple repairs elsewhere. Roads could be redirected, widened, or partially paved. Yet much of the decline reflected the limits of human capacity in the face of environmental, demographic, and economic pressures. The gradual vanishing of fences and the silencing of roads illustrate the interplay between human effort and natural processes, highlighting how ordinary infrastructure is both essential and fragile. Walking through such a landscape, one becomes acutely aware of the passage of time. Every leaning post, cracked stone, or overgrown path represents a history of human care, adaptation, and eventual neglect. These spaces, though quiet, are full of stories of ordinary persistence, subtle change, and the slow rhythms of rural life. Their silence is both literal and metaphorical, a reminder that history is not always recorded in battles or grand events, but in the patient maintenance and gradual decay of everyday structures. Thornbury was a modest village set in a gently undulating landscape, surrounded by meadows, small woodlands, and narrow streams. Its story is not defined by kings or battles, but by the quiet puzzle of cart tracks that appeared on fields and pathways, seemingly without explanation, and which remained visible long after their origin had been forgotten. These tracks, subtle depressions pressed into soil and grass, became a persistent feature of the landscape and a subject of quiet speculation for generations of villagers. The tracks themselves were ordinary in construction but unusual in pattern. Some were wide enough to suggest heavy loads, others narrow, resembling the passage of a single wheel. Their paths were irregular, crossing fields in directions that did not always correspond to farm boundaries or roads. Occasionally, tracks seemed to appear where no frequent route existed, connecting distant cottages or passing through uninhabited areas. For villagers, these imprints were at once practical and mysterious. They marked movement but often seemed to exist without a clear purpose. Daily life in Thornbury revolved around farming, animal husbandry, and basic crafts. Villagers plowed small plots, tended livestock, and harvested grain. Women maintained households, prepared meals, spun wool, and assisted in tending gardens or livestock. Children learned labor early, helping with chores, herding animals, or collecting firewood. The presence of the cart tracks intersected with this ordinary life. Paths worn into fields affected where crops could be planted, influenced grazing patterns, and occasionally required repair to prevent further erosion or damage to nearby plots. Several theories arose over time to explain the tracks. Some villagers believed the tracks were remnants of old trading routes, long forgotten after towns shifted and markets moved elsewhere. Others suggested they were created by itinerant merchants or traveling craftsmen, whose irregular patterns reflected the improvisational nature of rural trade. A few older villagers whispered of supernatural explanations, carts driven by spirits, the work of wandering travelers unseen, or ancient processes now lost to memory. While none of these explanations could be verified, the tracks remained, persistent and quietly enigmatic. Environmental factors also played a role in the tracks' preservation. Soil composition, drainage, and repeated use affected how deeply tracks were impressed and how long they persisted. Low-lying areas with softer soil held impressions longer, while compacted paths faded more quickly. Seasonal rains sometimes softened and reshaped the ground, yet depressions remained visible for years. Over decades, these patterns became embedded into the landscape, subtly guiding both people and animals along their paths, even when the original purpose of the tracks had long been forgotten. Economic and social pressures intertwined with these environmental features. Families who maintained farms had to work around the tracks, sometimes consolidating plots or redirecting small paths to accommodate planting schedules and livestock movement. Farmers and laborers adapted to the subtle constraints imposed by the tracks, demonstrating ordinary ingenuity. At the same time, the mysterious quality of the tracks sparked reflection and conversation, becoming a shared curiosity that linked generations of villagers through quiet observation and storytelling. The physical traces of these tracks were varied. Deeply pressed ruts suggested repeated passage by loaded carts or wagons, while lighter impressions indicated occasional use. Grass sometimes grew along the edges, and moss or weeds filled the shallow depressions, softening the lines but preserving the basic pattern. During winter or after plowing, tracks could disappear temporarily, only to reappear with rain or renewed passage. Their persistence, intermittent visibility, and irregular pattern made them both a functional and enigmatic part of the village landscape. Walking across Thornbury's fields, one could follow the tracks for considerable distances, noting the subtle changes in direction and depth. Occasionally, a track would intersect another, forming an unusual crossing without apparent reason. Sometimes, tracks would lead toward abandoned cottages, old wells, or areas that had once been part of village commons. In this way, they acted as both historical traces and practical guides, recording ordinary movement even as their original intent faded from memory. Despite their mystery, The tracks influenced daily routines. Farmers avoided planting too close to deep ruts. Herders guided livestock along paths that avoided erosion. Children explored the depressions, discovering old stones, bones, or remnants of previous generations. These interactions were mundane but cumulative, contributing to the ongoing life of the village while preserving the track's subtle presence in the landscape. In essence, the tracks were both a historical record and a tool of adaptation, quietly shaping ordinary life in ways both visible and imperceptible. Cold Hollow was a small village tucked into a narrow valley, surrounded by low hills and dense woods. Unlike towns known for markets, crafts, or political significance, Cold Hollow's story is measured in subtle signs: the faint traces of smoke rising from chimneys, the rhythm of labor in cottages and fields, and, eventually, the absence of those familiar signals. The village did not vanish overnight, nor was it destroyed by war or fire. Instead, it slowly quieted until the smoke no longer rose from its hearths, and the valley grew still in a way that marked centuries of human adaptation, persistence, and eventual disappearance. The village was small, perhaps no more than 50 to 70 residents at its height. Houses were timber-framed, with thatched roofs, central hearths, and modest garden plots. Each family cultivated a combination of grain, vegetables, and herbs, kept small herds of livestock, and relied on surrounding woodlands for firewood, berries, and occasional hunting. Life was rhythmically structured around labor, plowing and sowing in spring, tending crops through summer, harvesting in autumn, and preparing for long, cold winters. The smoke from each hearth marked the presence of life, its rising columns a subtle, comforting constant visible from paths, roads, nearby fields. Daily routines in Cold Hollow were ordinary but necessary. Women managed household tasks, preparing meals, spinning and weaving, caring for children, and assisting with animal husbandry. Men labored in the fields or tended livestock, sometimes assisting neighbors during harvest or in the construction and repair of homes and fences. Children contributed early, learning skills that would sustain them and their families. The smoke from chimneys was both literal and symbolic, a marker of survival, domestic care, and the quiet presence of continuity within the community. Yet the village faced persistent, low-level pressures that gradually altered life. Environmental challenges, including fluctuating rainfall, soil exhaustion, and occasional floods from nearby streams, affected agricultural output. Even small shortfalls in harvests required careful rationing and resource allocation, subtly shaping daily labor household decision-making. Over decades, these pressures accumulated, reducing both productivity and the labor available for routine maintenance of cottages, fences, and hearths. Economic and demographic pressures compounded these environmental challenges. Young adults often left Cold Hollow for nearby towns in search of wages, trade opportunities, or marriage prospects, leaving households with fewer hands to tend fields, repair roofs, or maintain fires. Families that remained faced increased workloads, often prioritizing immediate survival over long-term upkeep of homes and infrastructure. Smoke from chimneys became less frequent as fires were tended more sparingly, wood was rationed, and the labor required to maintain hearths in winter became an ongoing challenge. The decline of communal life was subtle but persistent. Cottages that once hosted neighbors for shared labor or seasonal celebrations grew quieter. Paths between homes saw less traffic, Children played in smaller groups or ventured further afield. The sounds of conversation, footsteps, and animal calls became less regular. The village itself seemed to retreat inward, each household focusing on survival while the social fabric gradually loosened. The rising smoke, once a signal of life and activity, became sporadic, thin, and faint, a visual measure of the village's dwindling presence. Environmental evidence of decline accumulated quietly. Gardens grew partially overrun with weeds, fences sagged, and cottages fell into partial disrepair. Chimneys, once blackened regularly by consistent fires, showed signs of neglect. Livestock was reduced in number as families adjusted to limited resources, and unused outbuildings decayed, their structures slowly collapsing under wind, rain, and neglect. The valley itself seemed to absorb the changes. Once regular smoke trails vanished into the still air, leaving Cold Hollow strikingly silent compared to its previous rhythm. Even as the village contracted, the people who remained demonstrated ingenuity and persistence. Fires were tended strategically, combining warmth and cooking needs while minimizing fuel consumption. Crops were rotated carefully, livestock managed to balance grazing with feed availability, and repairs were prioritized to maintain essential shelter. Yet these adaptations could only slow the inevitable transformation. Smoke rising from chimneys became an intermittent signal rather than a constant marker of life. Walking through Cold Hollow during this period, one could observe the interplay of persistence and absence. Hearths were maintained just enough to sustain essential life, while cottages and outbuildings gradually lost their former vitality. Fields were cultivated sparingly, paths became narrower as grass and wildflowers encroached, and the valley itself seemed to grow quieter, absorbing the rhythms of human presence. Life persisted, but the markers of its vitality, sound, movement, and smoke, were increasingly rare. Westley was a small village nestled at the edge of gently rolling hills, bordered by hedgerows, pastures, and a winding brook that carried water from the higher slopes into neighboring fields. Unlike towns known for markets or trade, Westley's story was defined by its gradual, patient retreat, families leaving their cottages one by one, fields left to grass, and a village that slowly emptied over decades without the urgency of violence or catastrophe. The departure was reluctant, measured, and shaped by ordinary pressures rather than dramatic events, a quiet unraveling of life and community. Life in Westley, at its height, was unremarkable but vital. Houses were timber-framed with thatched roofs, each centered on a hearth whose smoke rose like a gentle clock marking daily activity. Families tended small plots of wheat, barley, oats, and vegetables, cared for livestock, and maintained orchards that provided fruit for both sustenance and small trade. Women managed domestic chores, preparing meals, spinning wool, mending clothes, while children learned labor from an early age. Men worked the fields, repaired buildings, and coordinated with neighbors for seasonal labor such as planting or harvest. Every action, no matter how ordinary, contributed to the maintenance of the village's delicate equilibrium. Fences, paths, and small roads threaded through Westley, connecting homes, fields, and communal areas. These features were practical but essential, guiding livestock, delineating property, and enabling daily movement. Maintenance was constant, repairing fence posts, clearing paths of debris, and reinforcing minor bridges over streams. Each task was labor-intensive, yet ordinary and largely unremarkable, a rhythm that bound families and neighbors together. The village functioned through repetition, reliability, and small acts of persistence. Yet subtle pressures gradually disrupted these rhythms. Soil fatigue reduced crop yields, minor floods occasionally washed away fences, and livestock sometimes fell ill or wandered. The economic weight of maintaining households and fields grew heavier with each passing year, especially as younger villagers began leaving Wesley for towns, trade, or marriage prospects. Every departure increased the labor burden on remaining families, who were forced to prioritize immediate survival over long-term maintenance. The smoke rising from chimneys became thinner, intermittent, and eventually scarce, a visual signal of both absence and adjustment. The social consequences of this gradual departure were significant, though subtle. Wesley had never been large, but communal labor, shared resources, and informal social gatherings had sustained daily life. As households dwindled, collective work became sporadic. Repairing fences, clearing roads, and coordinating planting required negotiation and effort, sometimes postponed indefinitely. Seasonal celebrations, religious observances, and informal meetings decreased in frequency. While life continued, the underlying structure of social cohesion weakened, leaving each remaining family more isolated and dependent on careful planning rather than shared labor. Physical traces of decline accumulated quietly. Cottages showed sagging roofs, patched walls, and doors that creaked from lack of use. Fences leaned or partially collapsed, paths narrowed as grass and weeds encroached, and fields previously tilled with care began to revert to meadow or scrubland. Streams that had been diverted for irrigation grew overgrown with reeds and plants, subtly reclaiming human-managed terrain. The decline was unremarkable on any single day, but over years, the cumulative effect created a village that seemed abandoned even while a few residents remained. Adaptation was a constant part of life for those who lingered. Families combined households, consolidated fields, and reduced livestock to match available labor. Repairs were selective, focusing on essential structures while non-essential buildings fell into disrepair. Food was rationed carefully, and labor was allocated to maximize survival rather than comfort. Even these adaptations, while effective in the short term, could not fully counteract the long-term demographic and economic pressures gradually emptying Wesley. Walking through the village during this period, one could see both persistence and absence. Children still played along narrowed paths, adults worked the fields or repaired essential structures, and smoke occasionally rose from a hearth. Yet the quiet prevailed, fewer footsteps on the roads, longer intervals between sounds of daily labor, and fields slowly returning to wild growth. Life persisted, but the village's presence was increasingly defined by what was missing rather than what remained. In medieval and early modern England, the parish church was not only a place of worship but also the administrative heart of local communities. Baptisms, marriages, and burials were meticulously recorded in parish registers, creating the earliest systematic documentation of ordinary lives. Yet within these pages, countless names vanished, lost to obscurity, errors, or neglect, leaving behind a fragmentary record of existence. The story of lost names in parish records is a quiet meditation on the persistence of ordinary life, the fragility of documentation, and the subtle traces left behind by generations whose lives went largely unnoticed. Parish registers typically recorded essential information, the names of those involved, dates of events, and sometimes brief annotations about occupation, social standing, or familial relations. In larger towns, clerks or vicars kept these records consistently, but in small villages, consistency depended on the diligence, literacy, and health of a single parish priest or clerk. Mistakes were common, names misspelled, dates omitted, or entire entries skipped due to illness, absence, or distraction. Over decades, these small errors compounded, leaving gaps in the historical record that obscure the full picture of daily life. Many of the lost names belong to the most ordinary villagers. Farmers who plowed the fields, women who spun wool or tended kitchens, children who assisted with chores, and laborers who worked in fields or cottages were recorded only briefly, if at all. Their names were written with care for a moment, perhaps only in the notation of a baptism or burial, then never mentioned again. For historians, genealogists, or descendants, these gaps pose a challenge: how to reconstruct lives from fragments, or to understand the patterns of ordinary existence that shaped villages, families, and landscapes. The fragility of these records was reinforced by environmental and material factors. Parish registers were written on paper or parchment susceptible to moisture, fire, pests, and decay. Churches could suffer flooding, fires, or structural damage, sometimes destroying entire decades of records. In cases where registers were replaced, repaired, or rebound, scribes occasionally miscopied names, leaving further inconsistencies. Even when surviving, the handwriting, quill on paper, varying in legibility, could render names unintelligible to later readers. Every lost name represents not only a person absent from memory but also the passage of centuries in which ordinary life persisted quietly. The social implications of these lost names are profound. While parish registers recorded births, marriages, and deaths, they often omitted nuance: children who died young, households that moved frequently, or laborers whose work was unremarkable to clerks. Ordinary life, the day-to-day labor, the domestic care, the subtle interactions that structured community, was rarely captured in detail. Consequently, historical understanding relies on inference, reading between lines, tracing patterns of repetition, and piecing together fragmentary evidence to glimpse lives otherwise erased by the passage of time. Even surviving records are incomplete or inconsistent. Some years have meticulous entries, others are sparse. Some parish priests noted additional details, such as causes of death, occupations, or social status, while others recorded only names and dates. Cross-referencing entries across multiple parishes, counties, or diocesan records sometimes allows reconstruction, yet countless individuals remain unnamed beyond a single fleeting mention. Their lives, though essential to the functioning of villages and towns, exist almost entirely in absence, a paradox of historical significance and obscurity. The loss of names is also a story of resilience. Families often preserved memory through oral tradition, passing down knowledge of ancestors, stories of work, or patterns of landholding. Even when parish records fail, community memory endures, subtly shaping local customs, inheritance patterns, and social relationships. Villagers who maintained these oral traditions contributed to continuity, bridging gaps in documentation and ensuring that ordinary life, though partially erased on paper, was remembered in practice. Physical traces of these lost names persist in subtle ways. Tombstones, weathered and partially legible, mark individuals otherwise absent from records. Old houses, barns, and fields carry names in local usage or through property deeds. Occasionally, marginalia in parish books or other documents preserves fleeting references to forgotten lives, providing tantalizing hints at existence otherwise obscured. Each surviving fragment is a whisper from the past, a testament to ordinary lives lived quietly, shaped by labor, care, and the rhythms of daily survival. In the rolling countryside of late medieval England, villages depended on the quiet rhythm of the seasons, planting in spring, tending crops in summer, and harvesting in autumn. Harvests were not merely agricultural milestones, they were markers of survival, labor, and continuity. Yet in some places, subtle shifts, demographic, environmental, or economic, led to a harvest that, though fully grown and ripe, would never be gathered, leaving fields to stand uncut and slowly return to wilderness. Such is the story of a final harvest that no one reaped, a quiet testament to ordinary pressures and gradual disappearance. Fields in these villages were typically divided into strips, a practice that ensured equitable access to arable land. Families planted wheat, barley, oats, and other staples in carefully managed rotations, observing both soil fertility and seasonal patterns. Labor was intensive, plowing with oxen, sowing seeds by hand, tending weeds, and later cutting and stacking sheaves. Women and children supplemented men's work by binding stalks, carrying water, and assisting in storage. Each harvest demanded coordination, patience, and collective effort. The sound of sickles cutting grain, the rhythm of stacking sheaves, and the occasional shout across fields created a subtle soundtrack of village life. Yet the final harvest was different. Over years, population decline, labor shortages, and economic pressures gradually reduced the village's capacity to maintain previous productivity. Young adults moved to towns or neighboring villages for trade, employment, or marriage, leaving elderly or infirm households behind. Each passing year, fields became slightly more difficult to manage, fences and paths fell into disrepair, tools became worn, and accumulated minor disruptions increasingly constrained labor allocation. The crops ripened, but the capacity to harvest them diminished. Environmental pressures compounded these social and economic challenges. Seasonal rainfall variations, soil exhaustion, minor flooding, and pest infestations reduced yields, requiring careful prioritization of labor. Families that could not sustain full-scale harvesting were forced to leave portions of fields uncut, focusing their efforts on essential plots. Over time, these adjustments became chronic. Fields that had once been reliably harvested each autumn now required choices: which crops would be gathered, which would be left to rot, and how to allocate scarce human and animal labor to sustain survival. The final harvest emerged as the culmination of decades of slow attrition. Crops were mature, golden in the sunlight, and ready for reaping, but the number of hands available could not meet the need. Some families had already departed, leaving fields untended. Remaining villagers, often elderly or overextended, lacked both energy and manpower to gather the abundance of grain. Tools lay partially rusted or broken, oxen had died or been sold, paths had grown over with grass, making access more difficult. The final harvest was complete in the field but unreachable in practice. The social consequences were profound. Grain that could have fed households, supported trade, or stored for winter simply went unused. Families rationed what little they could manage, but the majority of the harvest succumbed to weather, rot, or wildlife. The villages shared rituals, long tied to harvest festivals, communal threshing, and social gatherings around reaped fields, were disrupted or abandoned. Ordinary practices that reinforced community cohesion were suspended indefinitely, leaving both social and material voids. Physical traces of the final harvest remain striking. Fields stand with uncut stalks, bending in wind and rain, slowly collapsing under their own weight. Paths leading into these fields are partially overgrown, fences sag or have collapsed entirely, and barns or granaries once used to store grain are empty, reflecting both human absence and the persistence of natural reclamation. The golden stalks, untouched, slowly decay into soil, returning nutrients to the earth in a quiet, imperceptible process, a slow, natural reclamation that contrasts with the human labor that would have otherwise transformed it into sustenance. The story of the harvest no one reaped emphasizes the interplay of ordinary life, adaptation, and gradual disappearance. Villagers did not abandon the fields abruptly, they managed what they could, adjusted priorities, and responded to constraints with patience and ingenuity. Yet even sustained effort could not overcome cumulative pressures. The fields themselves stand as silent witnesses to both human care and the limitations imposed by time, population, and circumstance.